Lee Kyung-suk, a mother who spent her entire life sacrificing everything for her family. She was the very symbol of devotion, yet her son Se Min-wook never once managed to say thank you. After his mother passed away, Min-wook lived consumed by regret. Min-wook's life had been that of an ordinary working man. He had spent every single day drowning in overtime, unable to even imagine something like work-life balance. It was something he had never even stopped to think about before. All the way until the age of 40, he had never truly questioned what he had been working so hard for. He blamed himself for not even being able to sit beside her and listen to her stories with a smile while she was still alive. At that moment, two older men entered the room. One of them gently told Min-wook to switch places with his sister and get some rest. He warned that if this continued, Min-wook would collapse before anyone else. They were Uncle Suho and Uncle Junho. They commented that Min-wook truly worked at a big company and said the company even took care of employees like this during funerals. Hearing those words, Min-wook gave a faint smile and quietly answered that after more than 10 years of loyalty, this was the very least the company could do for him. However, the 10 years he had devoted to the company no longer meant anything to him anymore. Uncle Suho sighed heavily and agreed. He said they should have treated Kyung-suk better while she was still alive. They should have at least let her hold a grandchild before she passed away. Trying to lighten the mood, Uncle Junho spoke up. He said that if Kyung-suk had truly gone to heaven, then she was probably being spoiled by their parents and their older sister up there. He then smiled faintly and reminded everyone how much their eldest sister had adored Kyung-suk. Suho nodded in agreement and said Kyung-suk had also deeply looked up to their eldest sister. The atmosphere gradually turned nostalgic as the two men continued reminiscing. One of them sighed and muttered that if their older sister had still been alive, they might have learned more from her and lived like proper people. He added regretfully that they could have even helped Kyung-suk continue her studies too. As Min-wook listened to the conversation, he quietly realized once again that his mother's deepest wish had always been to study. At that moment, Min-wook's thoughts turned dark. Rage surged through him as he blamed everything on one man, Lee Dong-ho. He clenched his fists and remembered how their mother had suffered ever since she was a child because of him. Dong-ho, the eldest son of the house, had gathered every last bit of money the family had, even selling the deed to the house before running away. People later whispered that he had wasted all the money and become too ashamed to face his family anymore. In the end, Dong-ho had taken his own life. It had all begun on January 2, 1962. Back then, Min-wook's mother was only 12 years old, just a 5th grade elementary school student. But despite her young age, disaster had already struck the family. They had gone completely bankrupt, left without a single coin to their name. As Min-wook remembered those painful stories, anger twisted across his face. He muttered bitterly that none of it would have happened if that scoundrel Lee Dong-ho had never existed. Hearing his words, one of the older men gently told him to stop talking about Dong-ho like that. He sighed and explained that those had simply been terrible times. According to him, it was unfair to place all the blame on the eldest brother alone. The old man quietly admitted that he did resent Dong-ho a little, but only because of regret. He said he understood everything now and was merely speaking from lingering sorrow, but Min-wook could not accept it. He declared that no matter how terrible those times had been, he still resented Dong-ho deeply and could never understand him. If it had been him, he would have lived differently no matter what happened. But now, he could not do anything. Looking at those precious moments frozen inside the phone, Min-wook realized something too late once again. Regret always arrived one step too late. After leaving the funeral hall, Min-wook returned home. Countless thoughts filled his mind. For a long time, he kept thinking about what he could still do for his mother, even now after everything had already ended. But when he finally entered the empty house, reality hit him once again. There was nothing left he could truly do for her anymore. As he stood silently in the living room, something suddenly caught his attention. His eyes narrowed in confusion when he noticed a strange talisman lying nearby. He picked it up carefully and stared at it. He remembered his mother happily holding the same talisman while calling out to him. She told him that she had spent a lot of money on it because people said it was incredibly powerful. She instructed him that when the day came that he truly needed it, he should do exactly as she told him. Min-wook suddenly snapped in frustration. He shouted at his mother, asking how many times he had told her not to waste money on useless things like that talisman. His voice was loud and sharp, causing his mother to flinch in surprise. Trying to explain herself, she softly insisted that it was different. She told him the talisman had come from an incredibly gifted master, but Min-wook only grew more irritated. He scoffed at her explanation and asked what kind of nonsense she was talking about. In anger, he shouted that if she really had money to waste on things like that, she should have just given the money to him instead. Even after their argument, Min-wook's mother quietly placed the talisman somewhere he could see it clearly. She gently told him that one day he should visit the master who had given it to her. Looking back, Min-wook could not believe how he had ended up living as such a rotten son. Min-wook let out a tired sigh. After thinking for a long time, he finally decided there was only one thing left he could still do for his mother. Since it was her final wish, he searched through her phone and found the fortune teller's number. He decided to visit the place himself, thinking he would at least confirm whether it was all a scam or not. When he arrived, the old master calmly explained the process to him. He said Min-wook only needed to write his name on the back of the talisman using his own blood and add a date as well. Once the ritual was complete, he would return to that exact date. Hearing the explanation about traveling back in time, Min-wook frowned and let out an awkward laugh. He muttered that it obviously sounded like a scam. However, the old man simply looked at him and asked whether that was truly what he believed. He explained that if someone believed, then it could become real, but if they refused to believe, then it would remain nothing more than empty words. Min-wook forced out a nervous smile while listening to the strange explanation. Half-jokingly, he asked if that meant he would actually become that person. The old master suddenly leaned forward. A strange smile appeared on his face as he let out a low chuckle. He told Min-wook that no matter what he was thinking, returning to the past inside the body of someone still alive was impossible anyway. Because of that, the exact date he wished to return to did not truly matter. Hearing those words, Min-wook's expression immediately stiffened in confusion. Before he could properly react, the old man revealed that instead of going back normally, the moment the original owner of a body died, Min-wook would enter that body in their place and live again. The old master calmly told Min-wook once again that if he truly believed, then it would eventually come to pass. He added that everything depended entirely on him. After hearing those mysterious words, Min-wook accepted the strange talisman and spent the next year living with absolute faith that the impossible would one day happen. During that time, he devoted himself completely to preparation. His room slowly filled with books, newspapers, notes, and endless records about economics, businesses, history, and powerful families. Every wall became covered with information from different decades. He researched important figures, major companies, future opportunities, and even personal details about influential people. There were reminders pinned everywhere, timelines stretching across the walls, and stacks of documents scattered around the room. Min-wook spent countless days and nights studying everything he believed could help him survive and rise to the top once he entered the past. By the end of that year, his entire life had become focused on preparing for the moment he would finally be reborn into another person's body. Standing before his parents' grave, Min-wook quietly said that he was home. A faint smile appeared on his face as he admitted that he missed both his mother and father deeply. Still, he felt that he missed his mother a little more, perhaps because it had only been a year since she passed away. After taking a deep breath, he finally made up his mind. He declared that it was time to try it. Holding the talisman in his mouth, he thought to himself that if everything turned out to be a lie, then he would simply return to living his empty and half-hearted life as before. Without hesitation, he pulled out a small knife and cut his finger. Then he carefully unfolded the talisman with trembling hands and wrote the date and time. Then he slowly pushed the paper into his mouth and swallowed it. Almost immediately, he began coughing violently. The talisman felt stuck in his throat, making him clutch his chest in discomfort. Sweat rolled down his face as he muttered that nothing was happening at all. For a brief moment, disappointment crossed his mind. Then suddenly, everything changed. A terrifying force erupted around him without warning. The offering scattered across the graveyard as his body was violently thrown backward. His eyes widened in shock as he could barely process what was happening. The world around him blurred, and panic surged through him. He could only scream in confusion as the strange power swallowed him whole. As the violent force consumed him, Min-wook's thoughts spiraled into panic. He could not understand what was happening to his body. Everything around him melted into blinding white light, and fear gripped his heart as he wondered if he was dying. A massive pillar of golden light suddenly engulfed him completely. Floating helplessly inside it, he began cursing himself in regret. He wondered if he had made a mistake by trusting that suspicious fortune teller and writing Lee Dongho's name on the talisman. His consciousness started fading in and out. Through the endless darkness, he weakly called out Dongho's name while trying to understand where he was. Then faint voices suddenly echoed around him. Someone urgently shouted at Dongho to open his eyes and asked if he was okay. Hearing the unfamiliar voices, Minwook slowly regained awareness, still confused about what had just happened to him. However, the moment he tried to move, panic filled his mind. He realized he could not control his body at all. He wondered in fear what was happening to him. Then a terrifying thought crossed his mind. The fortune teller's words suddenly resurfaced in his memory. He realized that he might have truly entered Lee Dongho's body right before his death, exactly as the fortune teller had predicted. Nearby, a shadowy man crawled desperately toward the bed while apologizing repeatedly to Dongho. The man's voice trembled with guilt and desperation. As the smoke filled the room, a terrifying realization struck Minwook. If this truly was 1962, the year Lee Dongho died, then the cause had to be coal gas. His eyes widened as he understood that Lee Dongho had died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Panic surged through Minwook's mind. If Lee Dongho had died this way, then what about him, the one who had just entered this body? Did that mean he was going to die the very moment he returned to the past? Gritting his teeth fiercely, he forced strength back into his body, thinking there was no way he was going to let that happen. The man desperately called out Dongho's name again and again, begging him to open his eyes. Dongho lay motionless on the bed, his body trembling weakly as if he could no longer put any strength into himself. The man beside him stared in panic. Tears formed in his eyes as he apologized to Dongho, admitting that he still wanted to live no matter what. He promised that he would definitely succeed and swore that he would repay Dongho's mother and younger siblings for everything. At the same time, Dongho struggled to stay conscious. His vision blurred as he realized he could no longer see his uncle's friend clearly. He wondered if the man in front of him was actually the one who had killed his uncle. The man lowered his head and told Dongho to rest in peace. But the moment he finished speaking, greed immediately appeared on his face. With trembling eyes, he suddenly began searching around frantically, wondering where Dongho had hidden the stock certificates. As the man continued speaking about selling the stocks Dongho had bought and giving the money to his parents and younger siblings, Dongho's trembling hand suddenly clenched tightly into a fist. In that instant, his eyes snapped open with fury. Before the man could react, Dongho lunged forward violently and smashed his fist straight into his face. The unexpected punch sent the man flying backward as he screamed in shock and pain. The man stared at Dongho in disbelief, barely able to process what had just happened. But Dongho slowly rose from the bed, his body shaking with rage. He cursed the man furiously, calling him a bastard for pretending to be a friend while allowing greed and money to blind him. Dongho accused him of trying to kill him. Dongho's eyes burned with murderous fury as he glared at the terrified man and declared that the one who was going to die was him. Dongho charged forward like a madman while the other man raised his hands in terror, desperately begging him to wait. But Dongho's rage had already exploded beyond control. He slammed his fists down again and again, screaming that everything was because of him. His mother had lived her entire life without a proper education. He yelled that she had always been ashamed because she could barely even write her own name. The man underneath him coughed blood and cried out in pain, completely unable to understand what Dongho was talking about. The man desperately told him to stop. He apologized to him again and again and admitted that greed had blinded him. He weakly apologized once more, telling Dongho to hit him more if he wanted because he truly was sorry. Dongho slowly approached him and coldly asked for his name. The man looked confused at first before stammering out that his name was Minsu, Kim Minsu. He then muttered that Dongho had inhaled far too much coal gas. The moment Dongho heard that, his expression twisted violently. He grabbed Minsu by the collar and demanded to know what he meant by coal gas. Dongho's mind raced in confusion. He wondered whether he had really passed out because of coal gas or if Minsu had intentionally done something to him. Minsu desperately tried to calm him down and asked Dongho if he truly did not recognize him. He swore that no matter how greedy he became, he would never go as far as murdering someone. He had only acted that way because he believed Dongho was already going to die anyway. Dongho clicked his tongue and slowly calmed down as he looked around the room. After thinking carefully, he realized the coal briquette heater was completely empty. That meant this was neither suicide nor murder, but simply a tragic coal gas accident during the middle of winter. But then his eyes suddenly locked onto the calendar hanging on the wall. His expression stiffened in confusion as he stared at the date written on it. It was February 1962. This was the exact time period right after Lee Dong-ho had died. Back in 1962, there had been a massive stock market crash that ruined countless people overnight. His uncle had been swept up in it, lost all of his money, and eventually ended up dying miserably. His mother's family had been so busy trying to survive during those harsh times that they could not even properly recover the body. She said that if his uncle had not become obsessed with stocks and rushed all the way to Seoul, things might have turned out differently. Hearing this, Min-wook realized that if the stock market crash had happened in May of 1962, then Lee Dong-ho should not have died before June. Yet the calendar clearly showed February. That could only mean one thing. Lee Dong-ho had died several months earlier than he originally should have. The realization made Dong-ho freeze for a moment before a grin slowly spread across his face. To him, this felt like an unbelievable stroke of luck right after returning. Meanwhile, Min-soo explained what had happened that night. Before going to bed, he had gone out to buy cigarettes. But while he was outside, the nighttime curfew suddenly began. Left with no choice, he hid inside an empty warehouse until the curfew ended. As soon as it was over, he rushed back home, only to find Dong-ho foaming at the mouth from the coal gas. At the same time, fragments of Lee Dong-ho's memories continued mixing together inside Min-wook's mind. He remembered that during this era there was a strict nighttime curfew that lasted from midnight until 4 in the morning. Streets would empty completely during those hours, and anyone caught outside would be chased down by the police. Dong-ho calmly told Min-soo to relax and sit properly instead of acting so nervous in front of a friend, but Min-soo immediately shook his head and insisted that he was comfortable staying like that. As Dong-ho watched him, fragments of memory surfaced in his mind. Kim Min-soo was one of the neighborhood boys who had spent his entire life supporting his widowed mother and 8 younger siblings. Considering the crushing burden on his shoulders, Dong-ho understood why Min-soo might have become blinded by money. According to Lee Dong-ho's memories, he had managed to gather 5 million won by even selling the deed to the house. In modern value, it would have been worth around 50 million won, an enormous amount of money for that era. And all of that money had been poured into the physical stock certificates lying in front of him. They were shares of the listed company called the Daejeong Stock Exchange. Lee Dong-ho had invested the entire 5 million won into those shares back in January of 1962, buying them at only 0.95 won per share. Curious, Dong-ho asked what the current price of Daejeong stock was. Min-soo answered that the shares had recently reached 3.65 won. The moment Dong-ho heard that number, his eyes widened. In just a short amount of time, the investment had already multiplied by more than 300%. Including the original investment, the total value had already reached nearly 20 million won, and it was still only February. A faint smile slowly spread across his face as he muttered for Min-soo to pack his things once the sun came up. Deep inside, he could hardly believe the opportunity that had fallen into his hands. It seemed Lee Dong-ho truly had possessed an eye for making money. Later, Dong-ho stepped outside and walked through the streets of the city. The atmosphere of the era surrounded him everywhere he looked. Nearby, several children sat together eating from metal bowls. One of them shouted excitedly that there was meat in the porridge. Another quickly laughed and explained that it was only leftover US Army cigarette butts someone had picked up. A third child suddenly cried out after finding a toothpick mixed inside the food. Watching the scene, Dong-ho quietly recognized the dish they were eating. It was the infamous pig slop porridge, the desperate meal many poor people survived on during those difficult times. The meal was made from food waste discarded by the US military bases after the war. Even something like that was still out of reach for countless homeless children wandering the streets. Although the Korean War armistice had been signed back in 1953, for ordinary people, the struggle for survival had never truly ended. Every single person was still fighting their own war every day. As Dong-ho thought about his mother, he could not help but wonder how she had managed to endure all those years without Lee Dong-ho by her side. At that moment, Min-soo approached him and casually asked if he was hungry and wanted some pig slop porridge. Dongho's face immediately stiffened, and he quickly refused, saying he was fine. Soon after, Min-soo called out to him, asking if he really planned to stay there any longer. He suggested they should sell all the stocks, head down to Gunwi, and finally enjoy life properly. However, Dongho refused, telling Min-soo that he was not planning to sell his shares yet. If he wanted to leave, then he could sell his own shares and head down first. Dongho looked at him in disbelief and asked if Min-soo seriously thought they would keep sharing a room together after this. He said that he would let him off this time because of their history, but the next time they met, they would basically be strangers. Hearing those words, Min-soo lowered his head and apologized to Dongho with a trembling voice. Dongho quietly looked at him and thought that, in the end, Min-soo was still just a kid barely 20 years old. To someone like him, who had already lived past 40 before returning to the past, Min-soo only looked like a lovable brat. With a faint smile, Dongho gently told him that he did not hold any grudges against him. Then he reached out and patted him on the head. Min-soo panicked the moment Dongho raised his hand. He immediately covered his head and cried out, begging Dongho not to hit him. They were standing in the middle of the main road, and Dongho could only let out an awkward sigh. In his previous life, he had been known as the useless son of a wealthy family, and now he apparently looked like some kind of street thug. Thinking about it, he wondered if he could really keep living like this. With a helpless smile, Dongho reassured Min-soo that he was not going to hit him anymore because he had changed. Then Dongho pulled out a thick stack of money and handed it over. He calmly said that it should be around 300,000 won and told him to buy some meat soup for his younger siblings. He also reminded him that he had earned all of that money himself. Min-soo stared at him with tears streaming down his face. In a trembling voice, he called out Dongho's name and asked if he was truly forgiving him. Dongho calmly told Min-soo that whether he forgave him or not did not really matter anymore. From now on, they would live like strangers. Still, he added that if fate ever brought them together again someday, they could sit down and share a drink. For the next week, Dongho focused entirely on making the drifting memories of Lee Dongho truly his own. At the same time, he trained relentlessly and worked to adapt to living in his new body. Even he found it unbelievable that a man in his 20s could possess such monstrous strength. He felt that if he did not tire himself out every single morning, the overflowing energy in his body would never settle down. As the days passed, Dongho fully accepted the truth. He was Lee Dongho now. One day he headed toward Myeongdong. During the Japanese occupation, Cheongmuro had developed into a major commercial district, and Myeongdong naturally grew into a bustling shopping area alongside it. As Dongho walked through the busy streets of Myeongdong, he sat down at a cafe and ordered coffee. However, to his surprise, the waitress warned him not to say such dangerous things so openly. She explained that coffee was treated like some kind of foreign luxury item and could easily attract unwanted attention. The woman looked at him suspiciously and asked if he was some sort of intelligence agent. She even wondered if he had just come up from the countryside because of how casually he talked about such things. Dongho calmly handed over 1,000 won. Seeing the amount, she quickly became excited and said they had to bring it out immediately. As she hurried away, she looked back at him and remarked that he really did look like a rich city boy. Dongho could only let out an awkward laugh in response. While he sat quietly inside the cafe, someone from a distance continued watching him carefully. After observing him for a while, the mysterious person muttered that Dongho looked like a student. As Dongho quietly drank his coffee, the mysterious man watching him suddenly approached and sat across from him with a grunt. Dongho calmly asked what he wanted. The man smiled and admitted that he had become curious after seeing such a young man casually spend an entire 1,000 won on a single cup of coffee. He explained that anyone capable of spending money so freely in Myeongdong had to be someone unusual. Then the man leaned back in his chair with a grin and casually asked if Dongho had also invested in Daejung stock. Hearing those words, Dongho's expression instantly changed. The coffee cup paused near his lips as surprise flashed across his eyes. The mysterious man calmly told Dongho that he had probably already made a huge profit from the stock. Since it was not too late yet, he advised him to cash out and walk away while he still could. Hearing that, Dongho narrowed his eyes in confusion. He could not understand why this stranger was suddenly saying such things to him. At the same time, curiosity rose inside his mind as he wondered if he should probe the man a little further. Dong Ho casually replied that the stock still seemed to have a long way left to rise. With a faint smirk, he asked if the man simply hated seeing other people succeed. The older man remained silent for a moment before asking if that was truly Dong Ho's answer. Then, leaning forward with a strange smile, he called him young man and remarked that Dong Ho had quite the appetite for money. He reached into his coat and placed a business card on the table. Dong Ho glanced down and realized it belonged to a reporter. The man then waved his hand casually and told him not to take his words too badly. He claimed he was only saying it for his own good before turning around and leaving the cafe. After the man disappeared, Dong Ho sat alone in silence while examining the card carefully. The name printed on it was from Dongsan Daily newspaper, reporter Park Won-sik. Quietly, more than 2 months had passed since reporter Park Won-sik advised him to withdraw his investment. Since then, Daejung stock had continued soaring higher and higher. By the end of April, the market had already turned into a complete speculative frenzy. Dong Ho believed that reporter Park Won-sik had probably spoken out of goodwill. As a reporter, the man likely possessed information of his own and wanted to warn others to calm down and pull their money out of the Daejung stock craze. But unlike everyone else, Dong Ho held far more certain information in his hands. Today was April 30, 1962. Myeongdong's stock exchange district was overflowing with investors and traders, all rushing around in excitement as the speculative fever continued spreading across the city. Using the 5 million won investment capital that Lee Dong-ho had brought, he purchased an enormous amount of Daejung stock, in total 5.26 million shares of Daejung stock. And today was the day he decided to sell everything. The people around him froze in shock. Some stared at him in disbelief, while others asked if they had heard correctly. One man widened his eyes and repeated that the young man was talking about 5 million shares. At that moment, Daejung stock, which had once been worth only 0.95 won per share, had skyrocketed to an unbelievable 41 won. The profits were astronomical. It was a return of more than 40 times the original investment, over 4,200%. Roughly speaking, the 50 million won had now become nearly 2 billion. Without hesitation, he sold every single share. Meanwhile, the people around the exchange mocked him openly. Some laughed and called him a foolish young man who understood nothing about stocks. Others hurried to buy up the shares he had just sold, believing he had made a terrible mistake. A few even pitied him, saying that he would probably regret selling those stocks for the rest of his life. However, Dong-ho did not care. To him, those so-called stock people were nothing more than fools who believed they were smarter than everyone else. None of them realized that from this very moment onward, history was about to repeat itself through another devastating wave of stock speculation. Later, he withdrew all of his funds, but he only withdrew 10 million won in cash and deposited the rest into his account. At the same time, he already knew the truth. Starting that very day, the leading stocks would begin collapsing at terrifying speed. The market soon descended into complete chaos. Investors screamed in panic as prices crashed like falling blades across the trading boards. Fear spread through the exchange hall, while fortunes disappeared in an instant. In the end, the massive collapse became known as the stock market crash of 1962. Everything connected to the speculation frenzy crumbled apart, leaving behind only ruin and countless victims of greed. As Dong-ho quietly walked out of the exchange building, some traders continued talking about him behind his back. One man asked if the others had seen the tall young man who had just sold everything and left. He wondered if some kind of information had leaked out. However, the others immediately dismissed the idea. They laughed and claimed that the young man was simply a frightened amateur who panicked after the stock price rose too high. He was Yoon Eung-sang. Stroking his chin thoughtfully, he admitted that the timing of the young man's actions felt strangely perfect. Even so, he convinced himself that it was probably nothing more than beginner's luck. In truth, Yoon Eung-sang was no genius investor at all. Behind the reputation he had built for himself, he was actually the con artist responsible for igniting the speculation frenzy that eventually led to the stock market crash. He was a swindler whose schemes would go down in history. At that moment, reporter Park Won-sik pushed through the crowd with a camera in his hands. Snapping photographs rapidly, he shouted that he would make sure the entire world learned about Yoon Eung-sang's schemes. But when he saw Dongho sell all his stocks, he began wondering whether the young man had pulled out his investment because he possessed inside information, or if he had simply listened to his warning. No matter the reason, he was glad the young man had escaped before disaster struck. In his eyes, the young man had managed to step off the express train headed straight to hell just in time. Meanwhile, Dongho walked through the pouring rain with excitement burning inside him. He could hardly believe that he was finally rich. He thought about meeting his mother again and imagined using the money to send her to school while still living a luxurious life himself. To him, it felt like an incredible era where money could endlessly create even more money. He decided that his next destination would be Gunwi. He planned to prepare carefully for the future that was about to unfold, step by step. Deep inside, he swore that his mother would never again suffer through the pain of that harsh era. But as he walked through the rain, memories of the suffering around him surfaced in his mind. He remembered the misery people had endured and began questioning himself. He wondered why he had studied so hard in his previous life and why he had been given the chance to return to the past. Standing alone beneath the storm, he thought that protecting only his own family from the rain pouring down on the entire world might not truly satisfy him. Lee Dongho, who was once known as Seo Minwook, looked at the miserable people suffering around him. He questioned himself about whether he was truly satisfied with only protecting himself and his family. So, without wasting more time, he traveled south of the Han River. He stood quietly on a small boat crossing the water. An old man steering the boat looked at him curiously and asked what a young man he had never seen before was doing heading toward the southern side of the Han River. With a faint smile, Dongho replied that he simply wanted to see the place at least once. The old boatman stared at him silently for a moment before explaining that Yeongdong was nothing more than rice fields and orchards. He wondered what there was to see in such an ordinary place. Hearing that, Dongho gazed into the distance and calmly answered that if he did not see those rice fields and orchards now, he would never see them again. The old man narrowed his eyes slightly and remarked that it sounded as though the young man was saying those rice fields and orchards would soon change into something entirely different. As Dongho listened to the old boatman, he felt that the elderly man was somehow different from everyone else he had met. Looking at the flowing river, he told the old man that even rivers and mountains changed over 10 years. No matter what they became, they would still continue to change. The old man agreed with him and told him to enjoy the scenery before continuing on his way. Dongho thanked the old man and headed toward Yeongdong, the land that would one day become Gangnam, the golden prime district of Korea. As Dongho walked across the wide empty land, he admitted that he had never imagined it would feel so vast and open, yet he already knew what the future held for this place. After the Hanam Bridge was built in 1969, the area would transform into land worth as much as gold itself. Towering buildings and endless development would eventually rise there. The land would bring unimaginable profits to powerful people and to the few fortunate enough to ride the wave of skyrocketing land prices. But Dongho knew the truth. Out of all the current landowners, only a tiny number would truly enjoy the coming boom. Perhaps only 1 in 100 would actually benefit from it. With that thought in mind, he arrived at a small real estate office, preparing to take the first step toward the future he already knew was coming. After thoroughly inspecting the vast lands stretching from the area that would one day become Hanam to Jamwon, and from Banpo to the regions that would later become Seocho and Yangjae, Seo Minwook finally made his decision. Standing before the endless open fields and mountains, he calmly declared that he would buy every single plot the broker had shown him. The broker's eyes widened in shock. To Dongho, the land was unbelievably cheap, averaging only 1,300 won per pyong. It felt like a heaven-sent fortune had suddenly fallen into his hands. He completed the purchase of 40,000 pyong of prime Gangnam land. Even so, he intentionally added extra money on top of the agreed price so the landowners would not feel cheated or shortchanged. As night fell outside the small real estate office, Seo Minwook explained that he would withdraw the remaining amount from his account later and that the cash he had brought should be used as the down payment for now. The moment the broker saw the mountain of cash, he nearly lost his composure. In disbelief, he shouted, asking how much money was piled there. Overcome with excitement, he immediately called for meat to be brought out, eager to celebrate the unbelievable deal that had just been made. Dongho ended up staying at the real estate owner's house for 3 more days just to stamp and finalize the countless land deeds he had purchased. Later, while riding the boat once again, the old boatman asked him whether he had managed to properly see all the orchards and rice fields he once wanted to visit. With a relaxed smile, Dong-ho answered that he had seen them thoroughly and that they were even more beautiful than he had imagined. The old boatman quietly replied that it did not seem like Dong-ho had merely looked at them. Dong-ho lowered the brim of his hat slightly and admitted with a faint grin that once he saw those lands, he wanted to own them. So, in the end, he bought a little. Hearing that, the old boatman narrowed his eyes and let out a small smile. He muttered that perhaps the times truly had changed. Then he jokingly remarked that Dong-ho's idea of a little was completely different from his own. For a moment, Dong-ho could only stare at him in surprise. He had expected that the old boatman was no ordinary man. The way he spoke made it clear that he understood everything perfectly. With an awkward smile, Dong-ho admitted that he had misspoken earlier. Instead of buying only a little land, he confessed that he had actually bought quite a lot. The old boatman let out a quiet laugh and asked Dong-ho what he planned to do with all that land. Hearing this, Dong-ho calmly asked if the old man was curious. The boatman smiled and answered that in over 10 years of working as a boatman, he had never met anyone who talked the way Dong-ho did. Hearing that, Dong-ho admitted that he was curious as well. He asked why someone like the old man was working as a boatman in a place like this. The old man tilted his head slightly and asked what he meant by that. Dong-ho quickly explained that he was not trying to look down on any profession. However, the old man did not seem like someone who could simply be an ordinary boatman. He also added that he doubted the old man had truly been working as a boatman continuously for all those 10 years. The old boatman smiled and told Dong-ho to answer first, promising that he would answer afterward as well. He then asked what Dong-ho planned to do with all the land he had bought. A faint smile appeared on Dong-ho's face as he answered that the land he purchased was an investment in the future. The old man's expression turned cold as he clicked his tongue in disappointment. He declared that Dong-ho was far more disappointing than he had expected. Pointing directly at him, the old man stated that he did not deserve to hear his answer. Dong-ho stared at him in confusion and asked if the word investment sounded wrong somehow. The old boatman narrowed his eyes and observed that Dong-ho looked barely 20 years old. He asked if his family had collaborated with the Japanese or if he had a soldier in his family. He scoffed that someone his age should not already be talking nonsense about investment. Dong-ho felt his irritation rising. In his mind, he complained that the old man was seriously getting on his nerves. Still, he could not simply dismiss him as a cranky old geezer because there was something strangely intriguing about him. Trying to stay calm, Dong-ho asked what investment meant to him. The old man answered sharply that investment was simply letting money make more money without sweating for it. He declared that a young man should instead be sweating and working hard to earn money, building and accomplishing something with his own hands. In his eyes, Dong-ho would never understand that truth, not in his entire life. Hearing those words, Dong-ho clenched his teeth. Yet instead of doubting himself, his conviction only grew stronger. Deep down, he became even more certain that he was not wrong. He calmly replied that just as his idea of a little was different from the old man's, their ideas about investment were different as well. The old boatman snorted and dismissed his words as nonsense. Suddenly, both of them raised their voices at the same time. The old man shouted about investment while Dong-ho loudly declared what he truly intended to do. He was going to farm that land on a massive scale. He declared that he would transform everything into huge farmland. The old boatman froze in shock. His reflection trembled across the water as he stared at the young man in disbelief. After a long pause, he stammered and asked if he had really said farm. He narrowed his eyes and stared at Dong-ho, unable to understand what he was thinking. Dong-ho gazed across the vast empty land and calmly thought that someday this place would become known to the entire world as Gangnam. However, that future was still far away. Instead of leaving the land abandoned until then, he decided that he would use it as farmland for the time being. Hearing his explanation, the old man let out a sigh and commented that it was farmland to begin with anyway. He then looked at Dong-ho and muttered that he truly was a crazy young man. The old boatman stared at Dong-ho and remarked that it was only natural to farm on farmland. Yet Dong-ho had bought all that land while calling it an investment, only to claim that he would use it for farming. The old man pointed at him and asked if he thought he could spout nonsense just because he was speaking to an old ferryman. Dong-ho calmly thought that it was actually the opposite. The old boatman kept questioning the perfectly reasonable idea of farming on the fields of Yeongdong, yet dismissed the idea of investment without hesitation. Although the old man looked like nothing more than a shabby boatman on the outside, Dong-ho was certain that he had a sharp eye for money and land. He then pointed toward the sky and declared that whether the land he bought would become gold or turn into worthless trash in the future, only heaven would know. But deep down he immediately denied those words himself. To him that was a lie. Even so, he firmly believed that the land would one day turn into gold, because it was not only heaven that knew the future of the land, he already knew it as well. And what was the point of leaving the land empty until it turned into gold? Instead, he decided that he would do the work the country needed the most but continued to ignore. That work was farming. He recalled the streets of Myeongdong in Seoul, where he had spent most of his life after being reborn. He had personally seen wealthy stock traders throwing away piles of leftover food while starving children desperately searched through scraps just to boil something to eat. To him, the barren lands of Yeongdong were no different. In post-war 1962, the area looked less like modern Korea and more like something straight out of the Chosun era when the entire country was starving and struggling. In his eyes, there was no better long-term investment for the future than farming. The old boatman quietly listened before a gentle smile slowly appeared on his face. After a long silence, he admitted that he was glad he had waited there. Dong-ho looked at him in surprise and asked if he had been waiting for him. The old man nodded and revealed that Dong-ho was the first person he had met since his father who spoke with such conviction about the land and farming. He then introduced himself, saying that his surname was Choi. Although he admitted that he felt too ashamed to reveal his full name, he simply asked to be called Mr. Choi instead. The moment Dong-ho heard that, his eyes widened as a memory surfaced in his mind. He finally remembered where he had seen that man before. Although Mr. Choi spoke with a Seoul accent, he could not completely hide the regional tone of Gyeongsang-do. He recalled reading about a powerful family with the surname Che from Gyeongsang-do. They had once poured their entire fortune into founding a university to nurture talented people, only to have everything stolen from them overnight. Looking at the old boatman again, Dong-ho quietly realized that he could even guess why the man had ended up working as a ferryman. There was a long story behind it, one he could not explain at that moment. After a brief silence, Dong-ho introduced himself as Lee Dong-ho. He then extended his hand and sincerely told Mr. Choi that if he ever needed help in the future, he could always come find him in Yeongdong. Mr. Choi laughed softly and said that Lee Dong-ho was too kind. He could not imagine what kind of help he would ever need. But Dong-ho immediately shook his head and firmly told him that was not true. Grabbing the old man's hand tightly, he sincerely asked him to come see him anytime he ever felt lonely or frustrated. Dong-ho promised that just as Mr. Choi had waited for him at the ferry, he would also be waiting for him in the future. Mr. Choi looked at him quietly before letting out a warm laugh and agreeing. As Dong-ho stepped off the boat, a thought lingered in his mind. A real world, in his eyes, was one where good people could live well. Yet he was no longer sure that the world he used to live in could be called such a place. Thinking about Mr. Choi, Dong-ho wondered at what point modern history had become so twisted. He wanted to untangle those knots with his own hands and set everything back on the right path. Before leaving, he told Mr. Choi that if he ever came looking for him, he could find him in the village across the river, at Old Man Choi's house. As Lee Dong-ho walked away from the ferry, he recalled Mr. Choi mentioning that he had 3 daughters. Among them, the third daughter was said to be the prettiest of them all. Sometime later, the village headman approached Dong-ho while they stood in the middle of the land he had been purchasing throughout Yeongdong. Curious, the old man asked why Dong-ho was buying up so much land and why he was building such a massive structure there. Dong-ho calmly answered that it was for farming. The village headman looked confused and pointed out that if the purpose was only farming, then a simple warehouse would have been enough. He stared at the tall building under construction and wondered if Dong-ho was secretly planning to build some kind of factory instead. Dong-ho smiled confidently and declared that if they were going to build something, then they should build it big enough so that no one in the entire country would ever have to go without rice again. Hearing such an ambitious statement, the village headman could only laugh awkwardly, admitting that he truly could not understand what Dong-ho was thinking. Meanwhile, some of the workers grumbled among themselves. One spat in annoyance and complained that even after hiring laborers, Dong-ho still stayed at the construction site from beginning to end, personally watching everything despite already being rich. Dong-ho silently observed the site with his arms crossed. He understood very well how construction work operated. Back then, just like now, if the owner did not stay on site and keep a close eye on things, workers would casually skim off materials for themselves, and a one-day task could easily drag on for 10 days. At the same time, there was a serious shortage of workers. The truth was that jobs were scarce, while far too many people were desperately searching for work. He knew the real problem was not the lack of workers, but the lack of people he could truly trust. What he needed were people who shared the same mindset and vision as him, yet he had no idea where he was supposed to find such people. Just then, someone outside announced that the temporary office was ready for him to use while construction continued. Dong-ho turned toward the door in confusion as the village headman peeked inside and mentioned that he seemed to have visitors. A familiar elderly man stepped into the office with a warm smile and greeted Dong-ho, saying that it had been a while. Dong-ho immediately recognized him. Though only a month or two had passed, he still felt genuinely happy to see the old man again. Unable to contain his excitement, Dong-ho rushed forward and embraced him tightly while calling out respectfully. The old man laughed warmly and joked that Dong-ho certainly had quite the enthusiastic welcome prepared for him. As Dong-ho hugged him, he smiled brightly. Ever since returning to this time, the old man was the very first person who had truly made him feel relieved and happy from the bottom of his heart. But suddenly, he noticed that the old man was accompanied by a young woman dressed elegantly in white. She politely bowed toward Dong-ho while standing quietly behind her father. With a gentle smile, she introduced herself as Choi Hui. The old man laughed proudly and explained that she was his youngest daughter, the precious apple of his eye. Dong-ho quickly greeted her with a bright expression, introducing himself as Lee Dong-ho and saying that it was a pleasure to meet her as well. However, Dong-ho soon looked around the small office awkwardly. He apologized, explaining that the place was only a temporary office for the construction site. Even so, he respectfully guided the old man to a chair and invited him to sit down for the time being. Dong-ho scratched the back of his head awkwardly and admitted that he was indeed short on workers. However, he explained that finding reliable people was not easy at all. The old man calmly revealed that his daughter, Choi Hui, was currently attending university and had recently taken a leave of absence. He proudly explained that unlike her two older sisters, Hui was extremely ambitious when it came to work. Still, because she was his precious youngest daughter, he found it difficult to let her work just anywhere. After saying that, the old man suddenly revealed the real reason for his visit. He said that he wanted to entrust his daughter to President Lee Dong-ho. Choi Hui lowered her head politely and softly said that she looked forward to working with him. Dong-ho's face immediately stiffened in confusion. Sweat rolled down his cheek as he wondered what kind of situation this had suddenly turned into. Stammering awkwardly, he asked for clarification. The old man narrowed his eyes and jokingly asked whether his daughter was not good enough for him. Hearing that, Dong-ho quickly waved his hands in panic and denied it repeatedly, insisting that was not what he meant at all. He explained that he would actually be honored and grateful to accept Choi Hui. To him, the old man's decision meant that he trusted him enough to place his precious daughter in his care. However, Dong-ho awkwardly pointed out the harsh reality of the situation. He explained that the office was only a temporary one where everyone was cramped together, and they even slept curled up on the floor. They did not even have a proper place to wash up. And most of his current work involved supervising construction sites. The workers there were rough and difficult people, especially for a woman to deal with. What he truly needed right now was not a beautiful woman dressed in stylish clothes. What he needed was someone like a dependable field commander who could stand beside him and handle difficult work together. The old man stroked his chin thoughtfully and admitted that he understood why the situation could be difficult. At that moment, Choi Hui suddenly stepped forward and politely called out to Dong-ho. She calmly stated that she had heard he was planning to start large-scale farming in Yeongdong, and the teaching her family had engraved into their hearts since childhood was that within 100 li in every direction, not a single person should starve to death. Choi Hui calmly admitted that there might indeed be differences between men and women when it came to physical work. However, when it came to pursuing a great purpose, she questioned whether there was truly any difference between them at all. She sincerely declared that she also wanted to become part of that dream. Dong-ho looked at her thoughtfully and admitted that her determination was admirable. At the same time, he reflected inwardly that perhaps he should test her resolve one more time. Even though it was the 1960s, he felt that bringing up the issue of men versus women might have been somewhat out of line. Still, the mention of her family's teachings caught his interest. He then brought up a rumor about the Choi family, saying that daughters-in-law who married into the family were expected to wear nothing but plain cotton clothes for 3 years. Looking directly at Choi Hui, he asked whether she would truly be willing to give up fancy clothes, wear simple cotton garments instead, and dirty her hands with soil while working in the fields. The old man looked at Dong-ho in surprise and asked how he even knew about the Choi family traditions. Dong-ho laughed awkwardly, but before he could explain himself properly, Choi Hui suddenly froze after hearing his earlier words. With a confused expression, she nervously asked if he was by any chance proposing to her right at that moment. Dong-ho immediately realized how his words had sounded. He quickly denied it and explained that he only meant to ask whether she could work with him while keeping that same determination and resolve. After hearing his explanation, Choi Hui smiled softly and said that she understood what he truly meant. She admitted that she had only been surprised because he seemed to know so much about her family situation. Wanting to respond to his sincerity, she decided to surprise him as well. With a gentle expression, she declared that, just as he had suggested, she would wear plain cotton clothes for the next 3 years. Then she politely bowed and asked him to take good care of her from now on. Dong-ho became even more flustered after hearing those words. He tried to explain himself once again, but before he could continue, the elderly man sitting nearby quietly smiled with satisfaction as he watched the scene unfold. Seeing this situation, Dong-ho smiled, thinking that it could all be called fate. From the beginning, buying land in Yeongdong among all the vast regions in Korea had already seemed like the obvious choice for someone thinking far ahead into the future. But out of all the ferries crossing the river, he had coincidentally boarded Mr. Choi's ferry. Even more strangely, Mr. Choi himself happened to be working there that very day for his own personal reasons. All of those endless what-ifs overlapped perfectly to create that single moment. To him, it felt like an unbelievably strange yet precious connection. At the exact moment he needed people he could truly trust, fate had led him to meet individuals he could rely on completely. Back in the room, Mr. Choi finally reminded Dong-ho that he should properly return Choi Hui's greeting before she ended up hurting her back from bowing for so long. Startled, Dong-ho quickly realized his mistake and awkwardly responded in agreement. He declared that he would also be in her care from now on. Hearing his clumsy response, Choi Hui could not help but cover her mouth and laugh softly. Sometime later he called out to Miss Choi Hui and reminded her that he had already explained before that the cotton clothes part was mostly symbolic. However, Miss Choi Hui appeared wearing simple traditional-style cotton clothing while holding documents in her arms. Calmly, she told Dong-ho that a woman's words should be treated as if they were worth 1,000 pieces of gold because such promises carried great weight. Hearing this, Dong-ho could only smile awkwardly. He admitted that while he understood her determination, he truly could not get used to such old-fashioned sincerity. To him, the difference between people from the 2020s and those from the 1960s was enormous. Still, there was one thing he could say for certain: she was incredibly old-fashioned in the best possible way. At first, Choi Hui seemed completely lost and struggled to adapt to the unfamiliar environment. However, she learned surprisingly quickly and gradually began handling things with confidence. As he watched her work, he could not help but think about the family that truly deserved to be called aristocrats. In Gyeongju, there had once been a legendary Manseokun family, a household so wealthy that people said one could not walk 10 steps without stepping onto their land. For 400 years, the family had been known as the richest household in Gyeongju. Yet despite the saying that a wealthy family could survive for 3 generations even after going bankrupt, they chose a completely different path. Instead of preserving their fortune, they spent their lives giving back until their wealth slowly disappeared. During the Japanese occupation, the family established baeksan trading in order to secretly support the Korean independence movement. They willingly abandoned their position as wealthy magnates and poured their resources into the cause. On top of that, they even donated all the company funds they had borrowed from the Shosun Industrial Bank to support the independence movement. In the end, every last bit of their fortune was funneled into independence funds for the country. After Japan's defeat, land reform policies and compensation through land securities made the collapse of the great landlord families unavoidable. Even so, the wealthy family of Gyeongju endured their downfall with smiles on their faces. Rather than clinging to their remaining fortune, they donated everything they had left to build a university in Daegu so future generations could receive an education. They were not simply a rich family, a wealthy household, or a powerful conglomerate. They truly walked the path of nobles, fulfilling their responsibility to society until the very end. That noble family eventually entrusted the operation of the university to the richest man in Gyeongsangdo at the time, Lee Hyun-chul of Daeseong. During their meeting, Lee Hyun-chul confidently promised that he would turn the institution into the greatest university south of the Han River. He also assured them that they would be properly compensated for handing over the operating rights. However, they refused. They told Lee Hyun-chul that compensation was unnecessary. Instead, they only asked Lee Hyun-chul to focus on nurturing the next generation of talented young people. But instead of nurturing students as he had promised, Lee Hyun simply handed the university over to the military regime after the coup succeeded. The reason behind his actions was unclear. Perhaps the military government had something over him, or perhaps he believed that staying in their favor was necessary for his business empire to continue growing. Thinking about all of this, Dong-ho suddenly called out to Ms. Choi Hui. Hearing her name, she turned toward him in confusion and asked what he needed. He slowly walked toward her before asking a direct question. He wanted to know if she had joined the company because she was trying to make money. Choi Hui looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant by that. Dong-ho calmly replied that he meant exactly what he had said. Then, with a serious expression, he asked her why she had decided to work at the company in the first place, or if she had joined the company simply to earn money. For a moment, Choi Hui lowered her gaze in silence. Then she let out a soft sigh and admitted that when everything had been taken away from her family, she finally realized just how angry it made her feel. To her, there was a huge difference between willingly giving something away and having it stolen. Even if the amount of money was the same, the feeling behind it was completely different. Hearing her answer, Dong-ho understood even more clearly that the story of the Che family was also Choi Hui's story. The bitterness of losing everything had been carved deep into her heart. He then asked her what she would do if she managed to earn back everything that had once been taken from her. Choi Hui answered without hesitation. She said the answer was obvious. With her own hands, she would become the one who gives instead of the one who loses. She never wanted anyone to take things from her again. At that moment, Dong-ho realized the meaning behind her plain cotton clothes. They were not simply old-fashioned clothing, but a symbol of her determination. They represented the resolve of someone who truly intended to practice noblesse oblige and live as a real noble through her own actions. Dong-ho smiled and told Choi Hui that it was good to hear her answer. He promised that he would help her make money and reclaim everything that had once been taken from her. As time passed, Choi Hui gradually became deeply involved in the construction work. Before long, she was running all around the construction site in his place, handling every task carefully and reliably. She even carried snacks to the workers, warmly telling them to eat before continuing their work. The workers happily praised the food, saying it was delicious. One day, while watching the construction site, Choi Hui noticed Dong-ho standing quietly with his arms crossed, lost in thought. Curious, she asked what he was thinking about. Dong-ho looked at the unfinished building and said he was thinking about what the building was missing. Confused, Choi Hui asked who could possibly be missing. With a gentle smile, Dong-ho replied that just as he had been fortunate enough to meet someone like her, the building also needed people. Choi Hui tilted her head slightly and asked if he meant they needed more people besides farmers. Dong-ho nodded immediately and explained that, of course, rice fields needed workers to tend them, but rice fields alone were not enough. They also needed people who could create value from the rice that was grown. After a moment of silence, she admitted that her father had told her to trust him and learn from him. Even so, she still felt that there were many other businesses that could make far more money than farming. She asked why he had chosen farming out of all possible industries. For a brief moment, Dong-ho looked toward the sky as if recalling important memories of his mother. Then he casually told her that she would understand soon enough. The workers nearby quietly watched the two of them talking together in the middle of the field. One worker wondered why Choi Hui always brought snacks for everyone yet never ate any herself. Another worker glanced at the pair and commented that they were probably important people discussing important matters. Even so, he could not help but admire how beautiful and kind-hearted Choi Hui was. To him she looked like a fairy who had descended from heaven. His companion immediately told him to stop dreaming, saying that a woman like her was far beyond the reach of someone like him. Embarrassed, the worker quickly defended himself, explaining that he was only happy to see someone as kind as her around the construction site. After hearing the workers talk about Choi Hui, Dong-ho finally understood the situation better. He calmly turned toward her and mentioned that she had said she was currently taking a leave from S University. Soon after, the two of them arrived at the College of Agriculture at S University's Suwon campus. As they walked through the campus grounds, Dong-ho jokingly suggested that maybe she did not need to keep wearing plain cotton clothes there. But Choi Hui immediately refused with a smile, saying that she could not do that. Hearing her firm answer, he awkwardly laughed and muttered that he would have to be more careful with his words around her from then on. Not long after, loud shouts suddenly echoed across the campus. A crowd of protesting students marched through the area, demanding that the Korea-US Status of Forces Agreement be concluded immediately. Others shouted for U.S. troops to leave Korea and repeatedly yelled for them to go home. Watching the intense protest unfold, Dong-ho quietly thought to himself that, considering the era they were living in, campus demonstrations like these had become a very common sight. As the protest continued across the campus, one of the students suddenly noticed Choi Hui in the crowd. The man waved at her in surprise and shouted her name, saying he had heard that she had taken a leave from school. Choi Hui politely greeted him as her senior and bowed slightly. The senior curiously asked what had brought her to the College of Agriculture. Then he looked at her clothes in confusion, pointing out that she was wearing thick cotton clothing even in the middle of the heat. Choi Hui calmly explained that they had come to the College of Agriculture because there was someone she needed to meet there. However, before she could say anything more, Dong-ho immediately stepped forward, his sharp gaze locking onto the senior as he questioned why he kept bringing up the clothes. He directly asked if there was some kind of problem with what she was wearing. Caught off guard by the sudden pressure, the senior quickly became nervous and awkwardly explained that he did not mean anything by it. After calming himself down, he turned toward Dong-ho and carefully asked who he was, wondering if he was also a student at S University. As he looked at him, a thought crossed his mind. He wondered whether the school someone came from had truly been that important even back then. Back when he had been Seo Min-wook, people had always judged others by their background. While he sat alone at his desk, working quietly, others whispered behind his back. They questioned which university he had graduated from and mentioned XX University with doubt. They also wondered where his hometown was and what his parents did, they questioning whether his English was truly good. Others mocked the idea, saying that even if his English was good and even if he was good at his job, it meant nothing if no one in the company was willing to pull him upward. That scene from long ago returned to him. Or rather, it was a scene from what was now a distant future. A moment from the time when he had still been Seo Min-wook came back clearly. He remembered how heavily Korean society valued school ties and regional connections, and he wondered when those things had become so important. For a moment he pressed his fingers against his face and fell into thought. Still, he decided that he might be overthinking the situation. Turning back to the man in front of him, he introduced himself as Lee Dong-ho. Then he calmly asked whether it really mattered if he was a student there or not. The man immediately became flustered. He repeated the name Lee Dong-ho in confusion and admitted that he had never heard that name before. Then he turned toward Choi Hui and nervously asked whether Lee Dong-ho was really a student at their school. Lee Dong-ho decided that it was not the time to waste on pointless talk. He also noticed that Ms. Choi looked a little uncomfortable with the situation. Turning toward Ms. Choi, he reminded her that he was busy and asked whether she needed more time to continue speaking with them. Ms. Choi hesitated for a moment before calmly answering that she did not. With that, she smiled and told him they should leave, addressing him as president. The two walked away together, leaving the flustered man behind. After arriving at another part of the campus, Lee Dong-ho looked around and asked whether they had reached the right place. Ms. Che replied that she thought they had, but since it was also her first time visiting that campus, she would have to ask some students for directions. Choi Hui belonged to S University's English Literature department, so it seemed she did not have any particular connection to the Suwon campus. Sei University had not yet become a unified campus in Gwangju. At that time, the law, fine arts, and liberal arts colleges were located on the Dongseongdong campus, while the medical school was in Yeongeon-dong, Jongno-gu. The various colleges were still scattered across different locations. As Lee Dong-ho walked with Chae-hui, he remembered the man with glasses from earlier and asked whether she was close with him. Chae-hui explained that she was not. According to her, he was simply a senior who was very active on campus. She thought that was probably why he had been outside at the protest. Lee Dong-ho listened and quietly acknowledged her explanation. Still, as the senior continued calling out from behind them, Lee Dong-ho noticed something else. He remarked that the man seemed to like her quite a bit. Then he leaned closer with a teasing smile and said that if this was how an unclose senior acted, Choi-hui must have been very popular at school. Chi-hui immediately lowered her gaze and denied it, insisting that it was not like that. However, her flushed face betrayed her embarrassment, and her cheeks burned bright red. Seeing her reaction, Lee Dong-ho laughed lightly and told her that a woman's words could be really heavy. He added that he had been learning that a lot lately, then laughed it off. Choi-hui reacted with surprise, and the two continued walking along the campus path. As they walked, Lee Dong-ho realized that he should stop teasing her so much. He did not want to accidentally make her cry. After asking around among the students, they eventually arrived at a certain professor's office. Lee Dong-ho knocked on the door, and a voice from inside told them to come in. The door opened, and Chae-hui politely stepped inside with a respectful bow. Inside the office, a professor looked up from the papers in his hands with mild curiosity. He was Professor Heo Moonho from S University's College of Agriculture. Seeing the two visitors, Professor Heo asked who they were, noting that they did not look like students from the College of Agriculture. Lee Dong-ho politely greeted him and introduced himself as Lee Dong-ho from the Yeongdong Agricultural Research Center. He then introduced the woman beside him as Miss Chae-hae, an employee at his company. He remembers when Miss Chae-hae asked why Lee Dong-ho had chosen to go into farming of all things. Lee Dong-ho paused for a moment, then answered indirectly by asking whether Miss Chae-hae knew what the children at the edge of the village had been eating just then. Chae-hae hesitantly guessed that the children might have been eating grass. However, Lee Dong-ho corrected her and explained that they were eating tree bark. He told her that people all over the country were so hungry that they boiled tree bark just to survive. Others steamed unknown wild plants gathered from the mountains, only to become sick after eating them. That up through the 1960s, most regions harvested rice first and then planted barley as a second crop. However, for about 2 months from May to June, the rice would already be gone while the barley was not yet ripe. Because of that gap, poverty reached its worst point, and people could not eat properly. Many were left to starve. Lee Dong-ho then declared that he intended to make sure no one in the beautiful land of Korea ever starved to death again. As he spoke, his thoughts drifted to the nationwide famine. He believed his mother must have been there too. He imagined her smiling gently despite her own hunger, telling her son that she was already full even if she did not eat. She would have urged him to eat instead, warmly telling him to eat a lot. Lee Dong-ho understood that there was no such thing as someone being full without eating. People had simply grown used to enduring hunger, and that was all. After letting that thought settle, he turned the conversation back to Professor Heo and asked what he thought about the Yeongdong Agricultural Research Center. He explained that on the way to S University, they could even register it as a legal entity. Professor Heo tilted his head in confusion and asked whether Lee Dong-ho was trying to scout him. Lee Dong-ho confirmed it and said that he wanted to invite the professor to serve as the head of their research center. Professor Heo was taken aback. He admitted that he did not even know what the Yeongdong Agricultural Research Center did. Then he made his position clear, saying that he had spent his entire life doing research and had no intention of running a research institute. Lee Dong-ho calmly clarified that he was not asking the professor to manage the organization. He knew that Professor Heo was deeply interested in crop improvement. What he was proposing was that they work on that goal together. Professor Heo calmly replied that if the matter was crop improvement, he was already doing plenty of that where he was. He saw no need to leave the university just to become the director of some research center. Lee Dong-ho did not back down. He told the professor that he wanted to create a miracle in Korea together with him. However, he admitted that he lacked both the technology and knowledge to do it alone. With sincerity, he asked Professor Heo to help him. To Lee Dong-ho, Heo Moonho was absolutely essential. This man was the very person who would create the miraculous rice variety known as Tongilbeo, or unified rice. It was the rice that would allow Korea to harvest twice as much and overcome the barley hump. Lee Dong-ho knew he could simply hire any ordinary researcher, pay them a decent wage, and have them carry out the work. However, if he did that, he felt he would be stealing Professor Hayo's rightful place in history. He wondered whether that would truly be the right thing to do. Professor Hayo listened to him and smiled faintly. He admitted that it was admirable to see a young man thinking about his country. However, he also pointed out that many people at the university already spent their nights researching how to fill the stomachs of the Korean people. Professor Hayo admitted that he did not see how accepting a director's position at the Yeongdong Agricultural Research Center would somehow advance his own work. Because of that, he apologized and firmly declined the offer. Choi Hui looked worried and softly called out to Lee Dong-ho. She thought that if he simply explained what he truly thought and believed more clearly, the professor might understand him. However, Lee Dong-ho calmly stopped her and told her not to worry. He had not finished speaking yet. Turning back to Professor Hayo, Lee Dong-ho continued with a serious expression. He asked the professor to think about just one person a day. Professor Hayo paused, slightly confused, and repeated the phrase to himself, wondering what Lee Dong-ho meant by one person a day. Lee Dong-ho raised one finger toward Professor Hayo and spoke with a sharp, unwavering expression. He told the professor that he was a murderer. Choi Hui froze in shock. Unable to believe what she had heard, she nervously called out to Lee Dong-ho and wondered what he had just said. However, Lee Dong-ho did not take back his words. Instead, he pressed forward, saying that while Professor Hayo remained safely inside the walls of the university, satisfied with the research environment he had been given, people outside were dying day after day. At least one person was dying every single day. Lee Dong-ho then looked directly at Professor Hayo and continued his accusation. Before Professor Hayo called himself a professor, Lee Dong-ho asked whether ignoring those deaths did not make him a murderer. The professor laughed and said that Dong-ho's claim was quite an exaggeration. However, the young man calmly replied that it was not an exaggeration at all. In fact, what he had told them was only the shortened version of the situation. Choi Hui, standing behind him, looked worried and asked whether he truly believed that only one person died each day. Dong-ho turned slightly and explained that the actual number was far greater. Many people were dying from hunger, and the number was not limited to one person a day. In reality, hundreds or perhaps even thousands of people lost their lives every day. The professor said that he understood what Dong-ho was trying to say. However, he added that he was already conducting plenty of research at the institute. He sincerely believed that the day when his research would save people from hunger was not far away. The young man found the professor's determination admirable. The professor's clear and unwavering gaze showed that he truly considered his research both his duty and his personal calling. His expression carried the firm resolve of a genuine researcher. Realizing that ordinary persuasion would not change the professor's mind, Dong-ho offered him a proposal. He asked the professor to work with him for only 1 year. At the same time, he wondered whether he could shake the professor's stubborn determination, even a little. He then directly pointed out that the professor's current research had a weakness. Looking seriously at him, Dong-ho said that the professor must already be aware of that weakness himself. The professor remained silent and slowly loosened his tightly clasped hands. Dong-ho noticed the slight change in his expression and realized that the professor's determination was beginning to waver. A small, confident smile appeared on Dong-ho's face. Dong-ho then mentioned the term hybrid sterility. The professor's eyes widened in shock. He immediately asked how Dong-ho knew about that problem. Dong-ho calmly explained that no matter how hard the professor worked to improve the strain, the resulting plants eventually became sterile. Because they could no longer reproduce, the professor was unable to continue improving them any further. Dong-ho pointed out that this was the exact problem preventing his research from progressing. Choi Hui quietly watched from behind as Dong-ho confidently approached the professor's desk. Leaning forward, Dong-ho declared that he knew the solution to the problem. The professor froze in disbelief. A moment later, he suddenly rose from his seat and demanded to know what Dong-ho had just said. Overwhelmed by shock and excitement, he asked whether Dong-ho truly meant that he knew how to solve the sterility problem. The story then shifted to an explanation about traditional meals. When 7 side dishes were placed on a table, it was called a 7-dish set meal. When 9 side dishes were served, it was called a 9-dish set meal. However, there was one essential food on the table that was so important that it was not even counted among those dishes. The one essential item on the table that was never counted among the side dishes was rice. A bowl of freshly cooked rice was placed in front of Min-wook. His mother warmly told him that it had just been made and would taste delicious. She added that he must have had another difficult day and praised him for working so hard. She then began reminiscing about the past. She explained that when she was young, the family had been extremely poor, and even barley had once been difficult for them to afford. However, Min-wook quickly interrupted her and asked her to remain quiet because he simply wanted to eat. Rice came from rice plants, and for Koreans it was the most important part of a meal. It served as the foundation of the entire table and was something they absolutely needed. Although hundreds of rice varieties existed, they could generally be divided into two main types. The first was japonica rice, which was commonly eaten in Korea, Japan, and China. The second was indica rice, which was mainly grown in India and Southeast Asia. During the barley hump period, many Koreans struggled to obtain enough food. Although they preferred japonica rice because of its familiar taste and texture, its yield was far too low to feed the entire population. Indica rice, on the other hand, produced a much larger harvest, but most Koreans found its taste so unpleasant that it was practically inedible. Because of this, researchers naturally attempted to cross japonica and indica rice. Their goal was to create a new variety that combined the pleasant taste of japonica with the high productivity of indica. At the time, developing such a variety seemed like the only way to overcome the barley hump crisis. Returning to the professor's research, Dong-ho revealed that he already understood what the professor had been attempting. He explained that the professor was trying to cross japonica and indica rice even though researchers in Japan had already given up on the same idea. Dong-ho clarified that this method was known as distant hybridization. It involved crossing plants that had separated from a common ancestor long ago and had since developed very different genetic traits. Although japonica and indica were both types of rice, that did not mean they were closely related strains. The genetic distance between them was extremely large. Therefore, even when researchers successfully crossed the two varieties, defects often appeared in the following generation. Eventually, the hybrid plants became sterile and could no longer reproduce. The professor stared at Dong-ho in complete shock. He could not understand how Dong-ho knew so much about the exact difficulties of his research. Growing increasingly suspicious, he asked whether Dong-ho was also a plant breeder like him. Dong-ho calmly explained that he was only a businessman who wanted to help the professor. However, he made it clear that he had no intention of helping someone who remained safely inside the university while people outside continued starving to death. He then confidently told the professor that everything could change if he decided to work with Dong-ho and his team. The professor stared at him in disbelief and wondered where such overwhelming confidence came from. He was considered Korea's leading rice researcher, yet even he had not discovered the slightest clue for solving hybrid sterility. Still, Dong-ho was confidently claiming that the problem could be solved if the professor joined him. The professor's thoughts became increasingly troubled. He remembered Dong-ho's earlier claim that one person was dying every day. He began to fear that refusing the offer would make him partly responsible for those deaths. After struggling with the decision, the professor finally told Dong-ho that he would contact him later. He asked for some time to think because he could not make such an important decision immediately. Dong-ho confidently told Professor Heo Moon-ho that 1 month would be enough for him to finish his remaining work at the university. Without waiting for a final answer, Dong-ho announced that he would return to pick him up after 1 month. Before leaving, Dong-ho added that the professor's salary would be paid in won and that he would receive twice his current salary. Standing beside him, Choi-hui looked surprised by the generous offer. Dong-ho then told Professor Heo that both he and the people of the country needed his knowledge, so they would patiently wait for him. As Dong-ho and Choi-hui walked away from the university, Choi-hui followed behind him with a confused expression. She quietly questioned why Dong-ho had specifically said that the professor's salary would be paid in won. 3 days after their meeting with Professor Heo Moon-ho, on June 10, 1962, a man suddenly rushed toward their office while repeatedly shouting for Dong-ho. The man was Park Min-suk, the company's third employee after Dong-ho and Choi-hui. Holding several newspapers in his hands, Min-suk burst into the office and anxiously declared that they had a huge problem. Dong-ho remained seated behind his desk and calmly asked Min-suk what had happened. In a panic, Min-suk shouted that emergency monetary and financial measures had been announced. Terrified by the news, he demanded to know what would happen to all their money. Dong-ho realized that his memory had been correct. The country was undergoing another currency reform. Around 1953, the government had introduced emergency monetary measures that changed the currency unit from won to yuan. Now, nearly 10 years later, the military government was once again implementing emergency monetary and financial measures. Under the new reform, 10 yuan would be converted into 1 won. Dong-ho understood that the government needed to reduce the size of the currency unit because inflation had risen too high. However, the reform involved far more than simply changing the name and value of the currency. Park Min-suk anxiously read the announcement aloud. Beginning on June 10, 1962, all circulation and transactions involving yuan were banned. Every form of payment in yuan had to be deposited into a financial institution. After that, access to the deposited funds would be frozen. Dong-ho calmly confirmed that Min-suk's understanding was correct. Chae-hui stood behind him, silently holding several files as she listened. Min-suk became increasingly worried and asked whether their company would truly be all right. They were about to pay their workers, but the sudden reform had thrown everything into chaos. He feared that they might no longer be able to access the money needed to pay everyone. Dong-ho calmly assured Park Min-suk that everything would be fine. He explained that if they waited for a while, the situation would eventually return to normal, so there was no reason to worry. Just as Min-suk began to calm down, he suddenly remembered all the food Dong-ho had stored inside the warehouse. Looking at him in surprise, Min-suk asked whether Dong-ho had prepared the supplies because he already knew the currency reform was coming. Dong-ho had hired Min-suk because he needed someone other than Chae-hui to handle the company's office work. Among all the laborers, Min-suk had appeared the most diligent, and his eyes had shone with the greatest determination. That was why Dong-ho had chosen Park Min-suk as the company's third employee. However, Min-suk still looked worried. He told Dong-ho that although he personally trusted him, the other workers probably did not. Since Min-suk had worked alongside the laborers until recently, he understood their fears and concerns better than anyone else. Hearing that, Dong-ho smiled calmly. He then called Choi-hu and Park Min-suk and instructed them to gather all the laborers and contractors at the office. The gathered laborers angrily complained that Dong-ho could remain calm because he was a wealthy young man who owned plenty of land. However, they survived from day to day on the money they earned, so the sudden freezing of their wages placed their families in danger. The crowd grew louder and shouted that they could not continue working under such conditions. They demanded to know what Dong-ho planned to do about the situation. Dong-ho remained calm as he listened to their complaints. He then raised his voice and repeated their main concern, asking whether they were worried because they needed money to buy food but could not currently use their funds. His words caused the workers to fall silent and listen carefully. Dong-ho reminded them that some of them had probably noticed the company's warehouse gradually filling with food supplies. He had been stockpiling those supplies for some time in preparation for the currency reform. He then announced that until the government lifted the deposit freeze, anyone who needed food instead of money would receive food supplies from the company. The workers began murmuring among themselves after hearing Dong-ho's offer. One of them loudly asked how long the stored food would last, while another pointed out that the supplies could not magically continue forever. Dong-ho calmly admitted that the food would not last indefinitely. However, he assured them that the warehouse contained enough supplies to support everyone for at least 1 or 2 months. He then gave the workers another option. Anyone who did not want to receive food could continue being paid in yuan as before, although the money would eventually be frozen in the bank and remain unusable. When one of the workers hesitantly asked what would happen if they disliked both choices, Dong-ho smiled and told them that they were free to leave the company. The entire crowd froze in shock. Dong-ho then raised his hand and issued a firm warning. Any worker who chose to leave now would never be accepted back, even if they regretted the decision and later begged to return. Everyone looked worried after hearing about the currency reform. Dong-ho told everyone that even if the reform turned everything upside down, they still had enough supplies to survive for 1 or 2 months, and if anyone still did not like the deal, they were free to leave. But he warned them that if they walked away now and later tried to come back, he would never take them back. Then Dong-ho asked if they had any better option at that moment. He asked if there was any other place besides this one that could promise to feed them for the next 2 months. Dong-ho then told everyone to work there for 2 months. He said that if things still had not improved by then, they could decide what to do next. Dong-ho told the crowd that they could always change their minds later. He said that he would be in the office, so they should talk among themselves first. Then Dong-ho told them to send a representative to him once they made a decision. He said they could call it both the carrot and the stick. The people started discussing the offer among themselves. Meanwhile, another young man thought that it was a risky move and could not be taken back, but for now, it was the best choice. Later, Choi Hui spoke with Dong-ho in the office. She asked him about what he had said to Professor Heo Moonho. She wondered if Dong-ho had actually predicted the whole situation in advance. Dong-ho was surprised by her question. He remembered that he had told the professor that his salary would be paid in won, and that it would be twice the amount he was getting now. He had also told the professor that both the people of the country and Dong-ho himself needed him, so they would be waiting. While walking outside, Choi Hui quietly repeated the words about the salary being paid in won. Dong-ho suddenly realized what he had said and admitted that it had slipped out by accident. He told Choi Hui that he was not a god, so there was no way he could have known everything in advance. He also thought that Choi Hui was not the type of person who would go around gossiping. Dong-ho thought that this was the era of a tough military regime. If the people in power even suspected that their plans had leaked, it would become a huge problem. Because of that, he decided it was better to stay cautious. Anyway, Dong-ho knew that the bank freeze issue should be fixed in less than a month. That meant there was something important he needed to do during that month. He was finally going to see his mother. Later, Dong-ho traveled by train with Choi Hui. While looking out the window, he said that the sky was really clear that day. Then he asked Choi Hui if she also thought so. Choi Hui became flustered and could not answer properly. Dong-ho told her that she did not have to answer every little thing he said, and he offered her some water. Dong-ho thought there was no real reason for Choi Hui to come with him to see his mother. However, after staying by his side through the scouting and the currency reform, she seemed to be paying close attention to everything he did and trying to learn from every small detail. Choi Hui quietly listened while Dong-ho explained everything. While they were away, Park Min-suk was managing the company well, and the warehouses and buildings were being completed one after another. The workers had even formed a defense group. They took turns guarding the food warehouse all night to protect the center that fed them. Because of that, there was not much for Dong-ho to worry about back at the company. After that, Dong-ho and Choi Hui transferred buses in Daegu. Before long, they arrived in Gunwi. When Dong-ho got off the bus and looked around, his expression became serious. Soon he saw the village in the distance. As he looked at the quiet countryside, he thought that he would finally see his mother. Dong-ho and Choi Hui walked along a quiet mountain road. Dong-ho thought that maybe he should have ignored the stocks in the research center for a while and come down to see his mother from the very beginning. He remembered that the eldest son, Lee Dong-ho, had run off to Seoul with all of the family's savings. He wondered how long a poor family could really survive after something like that. While they were walking, someone suddenly called out to him and asked if he was Dong-ho. Dong-ho realized that the man was someone from his memories. Dong-ho recognized him as Hwang Jae-suk and greeted him after a long time. Hwang Jae-suk was surprised and praised Dong-ho, saying that he had really picked up the Seoul accent after going there. He also said Dong-ho looked pretty cool. Hwang Jae-suk noticed that Dong-ho had many bags and offered to give him a ride. Dong-ho got onto the cart and nervously asked how his family was doing. Hwang Jae-suk asked if he meant his younger siblings. Then he said he felt like Dong-ho might punch him if he answered honestly. He then asked if Dong-ho was really the one who should be asking that question. Hwang Jae-suk reminded Dong-ho that he had taken all of the family's money and run away to Seoul. Hwang Jae-suk told Dong-ho that if his parents and siblings were doing well, they would not have just let him go so easily. Dong-ho became quiet and asked if that was really true. Hwang Jae-suk said that he had also been reckless in the past, but Dong-ho was on a completely different level. He said he did not even know whether Dong-ho's parents and siblings were managing to eat properly. Dong-ho felt bitter after hearing that. He thought that maybe this was how human greed worked. People kept telling themselves to wait just a little more and do one more thing before going to the people they loved. In the end, they made those people wait too long. Dong-ho remembered that he had returned to life earlier than expected by chance. Even after that, he kept telling himself that he would do just one more thing before going to see his mother. He wanted to prepare a little more before meeting her. But as he kept moving forward like that, time passed quickly. Before he knew it, it was already June. Dong-ho lowered his head and stayed silent. Chae-hui looked at him quietly. Then Jae-suk suddenly asked Dong-ho who the woman beside him was and jokingly wondered if she was his future wife. Dong-ho became flustered and told Jae-suk that calling her his future wife was too much. He explained that Chae-hui worked with him and was an employee at his company. Then he introduced her to Jae-suk as Miss Chi and introduced Jae-suk as his old friend. Choi-hui smiled gently and greeted Jae-suk. Jae-suk laughed and said he had almost embarrassed himself. He joked that it must have been a long trip to get there. Dong-ho asked Jae-suk if he was seriously trying to use a Seoul accent all of a sudden. Jae-suk replied that in front of a beauty, he had to sound cool and talk like a Seoul guy. As they continued riding the cart, they finally reached a village. Jae-suk said they had arrived. Dong-ho looked ahead and started to speak, but then he realized something was wrong. The place in front of him was not his house. Jae-suk told Dong-ho to stop doubting and said it was obvious that this was not his house. He reminded Dong-ho that he had sold his own house, so what house could he even have left now? Then he told Dong-ho to get off the cart. From Dong-ho's memories, he knew exactly whose house this was. The house belonged to Kim In-soo, his childhood friend. Kim In-soo was the friend who had once tried to betray him after being blinded by money. He was also the one Dong-ho had beaten up before they went their separate ways. Dong-ho stood there with Cho-hui behind him, feeling confused. He wondered why they had come to this place instead of his own house. Some children outside the house noticed Dong-ho and became surprised. One of them shouted and asked if it was really Dong-ho. Then the child quickly called for Dong-ho's parents and told them that Dong-ho had come back. Dong-ho was shocked when he heard that. He realized that Kim Min-soo was taking care of not only his own mother and 8 younger siblings, but also Dong-ho's family. Dong-ho saw his parents and immediately knelt before them with his head lowered. He asked his father and mother if they had been well. His mother gently told him that he had done well and that it was good he had come back. She said that since the eldest son was now home, they should all work hard together as a family again. His father complained and asked why a woman was speaking before her husband had even finished talking. Dong-ho realized that these two were his maternal grandfather and grandmother, but in this life, they were his parents. He promised himself that this time he would be a good son and show them the love he could not show his parents in his last life. Dong-ho suddenly heard someone calling for their mother, saying that Big Brother had returned. The voice was young and unfamiliar, but Dong-ho recognized it instantly. It was the voice he had wanted to hear more than anything. It belonged to the reason he had returned to this era. Dong-ho broke down in tears. He thought of that person as someone who had always looked at him with kindness, someone who gave everything and still tried to give even more. To Dong-ho, that person was like his own personal god. Just as Dong-ho was overwhelmed with emotion, she suddenly smacked him hard on the back of the head. Dong-ho was shocked by the sudden hit and wondered why he had been slapped from behind. She was angry and upset because he had not bought her anything to eat. The girl kept complaining and asked why he had not bought her food. Nearby, Dong-ho's parents noticed what had happened and laughed a little. His mother became angry and scolded the girl. She called her a little brat and asked how she dared to raise her hand against her big brother. Then Dong-ho's mother quickly hit the girl on the head. Dong-ho's little sister cried out in pain. Meanwhile, Dong-ho turned and looked closely at the child. As he looked at her face, he became very surprised. He realized that this little girl was actually his mother when she was young. The little girl kept crying and complained that Dong-ho had promised to buy her something tasty, but then he ran away. She complained that her big brother was the one who had done something wrong, so why was everyone taking it out on her? The girl sat on the ground and cried even harder. She said she was hungry and kept repeating that Dong-ho had promised to buy her something tasty. Dong-ho looked at her crying face and became quiet. He stared at her carefully and felt emotional. Then the girl suddenly hugged him while crying loudly. Dong-ho was shocked and embarrassed as he held her. In his mind, he greeted her politely, thinking that this child was his 12-year-old mother. He felt strange and overwhelmed by the situation. Sometime later, Min-soo and his mother prepared food for everyone. When they saw that Dong-ho had bought so much meat, they became excited. They quickly prepared and cooked the meat very well. Seeing the smiles on their faces, Dong-ho became happy. Because the currency reform had caused too much chaos, normal buying and selling had become almost impossible. So Dong-ho came back with both hands full of meat. There were many people to feed. Min-soo's mother, Min-soo, and his 8 younger siblings made 10 people. With Dong-ho's parents and siblings, there were 5 more people. Altogether, it was a very large group. Dong-ho looked at everyone and thought about how Min-soo had been taking care of all of them. he realized that Minsu had carried a heavy burden for a long time. Minsu then brought food to Dongho and told him to think of it as repayment for the beating he had received. He smiled and told Dongho to eat with him and have a drink together as friends. Dongho smiled softly after hearing this. The atmosphere became warmer. After that, Dongho's father told everyone to sit down and eat. The children immediately became excited and rushed toward the food while shouting happily. The little girl suddenly shouted for her mother while everyone was eating. Her mother became angry and asked why she was yelling at the table during the meal. The girl looked at the bowls and became even more upset. She noticed that Dongho's bowls were full of meat, while her own bowl only smelled like chicken. She complained loudly because she felt it was unfair. Dongho smiled and called the girl by her name, Gyeongsuk. He told her to switch bowls with him. The girl was surprised and asked if he really meant it. After switching bowls, Gyeongsuk became very happy. She ate the chicken leg with great excitement and told her mother that it tasted very good. She said it melted in her mouth. Dongho laughed softly as he watched her enjoy the food. But the girl still complained that her mother, father and big brother had been keeping all the good food for themselves until now. Dongho smiled gently and asked if the food was good. Then he told her to eat a lot. He said that from now on, her big brother would buy her plenty of meat so she could eat as much as she wanted. Dongho looked down quietly, and suddenly his chest began to ache. He looked at the 12-year-old Lee Gyeongsuk, who was happily eating in front of him. He thought that the young Lee Gyeongsuk he had never seen in Min-wook's life was very bright and pure. She said whatever she wanted without holding back, and smiled like any normal child. Dongho wondered how many hardships she had gone through in life. He wondered how many times she had swallowed her pain, held her chest in secret, and comforted herself while moving forward. He remembered his mother from his own life. During meals, she would say that she did not really like meat, and that the lettuce was fresh and tasty. Dongho realized that she had probably only said that so others could eat the meat instead. That thought made Dongho feel even heavier inside. Later that night, Dongho sat outside with young Gyeongsuk under the night sky. Gyeongsuk told him that, to her, her big brother was the coolest person in the world. Dongho was surprised and said he was not cool at all. But Gyeongsuk said that her big brother was always cool, had handsome hands and was the nicest person to her. Then she looked at him and asked if he was going to become a thug. Dongho was caught off guard by her sudden question. Dongho sat with young Gyeongsuk resting on his lap. He gently asked her what she wanted him to become. He told her that whatever she said, he would do it. As he looked at her under the night sky, Dongho thought that this was the reason he had been reborn from the very beginning. It was not for some great cause, fame or success. He only wanted to make his mother happy. Dongho thought that if his mother at 12 years old wanted something from him, then no matter what it was, he would find a way to make it happen. Gyeongsuk began to say that she wanted her big brother to do what he wanted. Dongho was confused and asked what she meant. Gyeongsuk said that her big brother should do whatever he wanted. She told him that if he wanted to become a thug, then he should become a thug. And if he wanted to become president, then he should become president. He could do anything. Dongho was deeply moved by her words. He looked at her and thought that no matter the era, his mother had always been the one person who prayed only for his happiness. Dongho gently asked her if it was really okay for him to leave home again. Gyeongsuk said it was okay. She told him that if he lived his life while holding himself back and giving up on what he wanted, then they would also have to live like that. She said that if Dongho did not follow his heart, they would only feel bad too. Then Gyeongsuk told him to live the way he wanted. Dongho became quiet after hearing her words. He felt thankful from the bottom of his heart. He thanked her sincerely. As they sat together under the night sky, Dongho silently promised that he would protect Gyeongsuk. Gyeongsuk told Dongho to make sure he was truly happy. She said her big brother could do anything. Then, while half asleep, she said that he was the person she loved more than anyone in the whole world. Dongho looked at the night sky and held her quietly. Her words made him think about what he really wanted to do after being reborn. With his knowledge of the future, Dongho knew he could become rich and live a comfortable life. He could use his awareness of future events to gain money and power. But then he asked himself if that was truly what he wanted. Dongho thought about Gyeongsuk and the promise he had made to protect her. As he carried her in his arms, his expression became serious. In the end, Dongho realized that simply becoming rich was not what he truly wanted. The unclear plans he had after being reborn began to become clear in his heart. He decided that he wanted to live in a truly cool way. He wanted to do something that could help as many people as possible. He also wanted to become a big brother that Kyungsuk would be so proud of that it would make her excited. Dong-ho thought that this would be the last day he looked at her as his mother. From now on, he would see her as the young Kyungsuk standing in front of him. After being reborn, Dong-ho was glad that the first thing he chose was farming. He believed it was the right first step because it helped make sure there were no hungry children like Kyungsuk once was. He also wanted to make sure that none of the neighbors would starve to death. Dong-ho felt that this was a solid first step toward his new path. Then, under the night sky, Dong-ho carried his sister inside the house and made her sleep with Miss Chae. Looking at Dong-ho's sister's smiling face, Miss Choi called out to Dong-ho and told him that he had a good time with his little sister. Dong-ho replied that they had a lot to talk about, so their conversation became long. Then he looked at Miss Choi and said that since they were already on the subject, he had made a sudden decision. Miss Choi looked at him calmly and listened. Dong-ho then told her that he had some new tasks for her to start from tomorrow. The next morning, Dong-ho wondered about moving away from Gunwi. His family found it hard to imagine leaving Gunwi because they had lived there their whole lives. One of them said it might not change much since Dong-ho had said he would prepare a small plot of land for them to farm in Yeongdong. Dong-ho smiled and wondered if it would really be only a small plot. In the end, they decided that the whole family would move to Seoul. Dong-ho walked through the mountains and thought about Gunwi. It was not an impossible place to live, but transportation was difficult. With the current level of development, it was hard to even keep up with the news. Also, the old family house was already gone, so moving to the city felt like a better choice. Later that night, Dong-ho met Miss Chae outside. He told her that there was something he wanted to ask of her. Miss Chae looked at him with a calm smile and waited for him to speak. Choi Hui helped Dong-ho and his parents with moving his siblings to new schools and organizing their household belongings. Thanks to her help, they finished packing everything within a week and left for Yeongdong, Seoul. At the train station, someone told Dong-ho that this time he was the one getting on the train and leaving. Dong-ho calmly replied that it was not like they would never see each other again. He reminded them that they and their family could come to Yeongdong anytime. Dong-ho also suggested that Min-soo come to Seoul, but Min-soo was not like him. Min-soo did not want to leave behind the home and work he had built there. More than anything, he did not want to move far away from his father's grave. Dong-ho then told Min-soo that they still had not had that drink together. He told Min-soo to think about his younger brothers and sisters and show them more of the world. He said that whenever Min-soo was ready, he could come with only the clothes on his back and not worry about anything else. Before leaving for Seoul, Dong-ho opened a bank account in Min-soo's name and deposited money for him. The deposit freeze from the currency reform would soon be lifted. Once Min-soo withdrew the money, he and his family would be able to eat and live comfortably for a while. Min-soo stood near the train and bowed deeply, feeling grateful for what Dong-ho had done for him. Dong-ho thought that because Min-soo had taken care of his family while he was gone, the money was not something he would ever miss. He also thought that maybe the old Lee Dong-ho had treated his friend like a servant, but Dong-ho did not want to do that anymore. As the train prepared to leave, the children became excited and shouted that it was departure time. Min-soo became emotional and ran after the train. He shouted that he was sorry and thanked Dong-ho. Dong-ho decided to trust Min-soo one more time because they were friends. After arriving in Seoul, Dong-ho met the real estate agent again. The agent laughed happily and said that he had been lucky to meet Dong-ho as his benefactor that year. He said the deals he had made with Dong-ho were worth more than all the business he had done in his past years combined. The house Dong-ho had first prepared was still under construction, so the real estate agent quickly bought another house nearby. It was big enough for the 6 people in Dong-ho's family to stay in for a while. Dong-ho's father looked at the land in front of them and asked if the real estate agent had said that land belonged to them. He wondered if the paddy field nearby was the place. Dong-ho's father thought that must be the field he would farm. He sighed and said that farming such a large area would break his back. Dong-ho smiled awkwardly and told him that was not the land. His father then pointed to another field and guessed that it might be the correct one because the size looked just right for farming. But Dong-ho again told him that it was not that place either. His brothers became confused and asked if the big plot over there was theirs. Dong-ho looked at his family and thought about how the eldest son had run away with the house deed, then returned claiming that he had earned a lot of money. However, none of them asked how much he had actually made. To them, just being able to see the family member they thought they might never see again was enough. Then Dong-ho showed his father the land. He told him that all the land he could see belonged to them. He said that from now on, his father would no longer have to farm alone. Dong-ho told his father that he would have to hire many workers to farm all the land. His father was shocked after hearing this. One of Dong-ho's younger brothers quietly said that he thought their big brother had gone a little crazy. Dong-ho heard him and immediately said that he could hear him. Later, Dong-ho thought back to important meetings and deals from his past life. Then time moved forward to mid-July 1962. While helping his family settle in and going back and forth between the warehouses and construction sites, time passed very quickly. Thanks to Chae-hui's fast work, Dong-ho's siblings' school transfers were handled smoothly. Gunhui had been a rural area, and Yeongdong was still countryside too, so everyone adjusted without much trouble. As Choi-hui had more and more people to meet for work, she started wearing more practical clothes. Once the shock from the currency reform began to calm down, Professor Hyo Moon-ho decided to join Dong-ho. He probably accepted Dong-ho's offer not because of the salary or the title of research center director, but because he believed they might finally solve the hybrid sterility problem. Around the same time, the research center building was completed. Professor Heo and a few of his students and the researchers who had worked with Professor Heo also started coming to the center. Dong-ho knew they were not there because they trusted him. They came because they trusted Professor Heo. Professor Heo had placed his hopes on Dong-ho and told them about this new research center that they had never even heard of before. Dong-ho told them that commuting out to Yeongdong must be tiring. He said the dorms would be finished within a month or two, so he asked them to bear with it a little longer. Professor Heo replied that enduring things was what researchers were best at. He also said he had not been sure that a seed research center would really be built, but seeing it now made him excited to work. He thanked President Lee. However, he also said that even though the top-class facilities and preparations were wonderful, every researcher there was stretching their necks and waiting for the answer. Dong-ho sat calmly in front of the research team. The backgrounds and resumes of the people Professor Heo had brought with him were very impressive. It started with Chief Researcher Hong Sung-gu, who had quit his post at the Ministry of Agriculture to join them. Most of the researchers were already leading scholars in Korean agriculture, and in the future, they would become the driving force behind the country's agricultural development. They were all ready to throw themselves into one clear goal, which was to increase rice yields. Because of that, Dong-ho decided to show them a faster path. Of course, he already knew that path. He began by talking about a wish for a rich harvest in a barren age. Then he explained that everyone knew Annam rice had very high yield, while Japonica rice was better in taste. Dong-ho explained that if crossing Indica and Japonica rice with only 2 types did not solve the sterility problem, then they should use 3 types instead. The researchers were shocked and asked what he meant by using 3. They wondered if such an idea even made sense. One researcher said they should at least listen to him until the end. Dong-ho believed that if it was Professor Heo who would one day develop unified rice, then he would definitely understand. Dong-ho explained that they were currently using Japonica as the base and trying to graft it onto the high yield of Indica. He said that this was their blind spot. The base strain should be Indica first. He added that, for now, yield should be the top priority. One researcher realized that Dong-ho was right. The main purpose of their current research was yield. Dong-ho then suggested calling the distant cross between Japonica A and Indica B hybrid C. Dong-ho explained that distant hybridization meant crossing crops that were only distantly related and had very different genetic traits. He said hybrid C had half of each parent's traits. He explained that hybrid C also had half of the Indica line that was genetically close to C's base. Dong-ho then asked them what they thought would happen if they did that. He said that, by crossing C with D, which was genetically similar to C's base, they could strengthen the high-yield trait of the Indica base at the same time. Professor Heo was shocked and said there was no way. The other researchers also became surprised as they realized what Dong-ho meant. They understood that he was talking about the 3-way hybrid method. Professor Heo became excited and said that this was it. Dong-ho calmly said that Professor Heo understood right away. In his mind, Dong-ho knew that Professor Heo had spent years solving this exact problem through endless trial and error in the original timeline. Dong-ho then looked at him and asked if he understood. One of the researchers raised his hand and said that he had a question. The researchers were surprised when Dong-ho immediately understood the core problem with the 3-way hybrid rice project. He pointed out that if the base parent was an Indica variety, then the final hybrid rice would naturally lean more toward the Indica type instead of being a true balance between Indica and Japonica. The senior researchers admired his sharp insight and praised him as someone who could grasp the heart of a problem instantly. Dong-ho calmly agreed with their conclusion and suggested that they use seedlings that were closer to the indica type. He explained that their first priority was to increase rice production, so choosing an indica-based hybrid would ensure a much higher yield. The researchers nodded in agreement, believing they had found the right solution. However, Dong-ho raised another important issue. He explained that because the hybrid was based on indica rice, its taste would be much worse than the japonica rice people were used to eating. Everyone in the room fell silent. They had been so focused on improving yield that they had completely overlooked the problem of taste. Dong-ho then explained that their real goal was not just to produce more rice. They needed to keep the high yield while improving the taste until it matched the quality of their original japonica rice. He told everyone that solving this challenge was the true mission of the research center. Inspired by Dong-ho's words, the researchers immediately began discussing ideas and reviewing their documents. After a while, one of them asked whether, now that they had understood the core concept of three-way hybridization, they should quickly develop the new seedlings, distribute them across the country, and prepare next year's rice crops as soon as possible. Dong-ho explained that if they released the current hybrid rice, its taste would be terrible. At best, it would only prove that an indica variety could grow in Korea's climate. It would not achieve anything more than that. He added that if they wanted to create a variety that truly tasted good, it would not be possible by next year because improving flavor through breeding required time. Professor Hyo quietly thought about Dong-ho's words. After a moment, he nodded and admitted that he understood. Dong-ho realized that Professor Hyo was probably wondering whether taste was really that important. Dong-ho then explained that there was a major difference in perspective between researchers, who focused on developing new rice varieties, and the ordinary people who would actually eat the rice every day. He recalled that in the original timeline, Professor Hyo eventually succeeded in creating the famous unified rice after years of hard work. It completely achieved its goal of greatly increasing rice production and became a remarkable milestone in Korean agricultural history. However, despite its success, the rice tasted so bad that even farmers eventually stopped growing it because consumers did not want to eat it. Determined not to repeat that mistake, Dong-ho told everyone that the rice they developed had to be better than that. From then on, he visited the research center every day and used all the knowledge he remembered from the future to carefully review the researchers' results, helping them avoid mistakes and improve their work. Dong-ho spent every day guiding the researchers in the right direction. Using the knowledge he remembered from the future, he helped them avoid unnecessary trial and error, allowing their research to progress much faster. He knew that the three-way hybrid method was only a breeding technique. Depending on the order of the crossbreeding and the rice strains they selected, they could create a new variety that was even better than the unified rice developed in the original timeline. However, Dong-ho reminded himself not to rush. He realized they first had to successfully develop unified rice. Only after achieving that milestone would they have the foundation needed to continue improving it further. As he thought about the next step, Dong-ho remembered that the key japonica rice strain required for unified rice was located in Japan. On August 14th, Dong-ho informed the research center that he would be traveling to Japan with Mr. Park Min-suk. He politely asked if that arrangement was acceptable. Miss Choi did not answer immediately, making Dong-ho realize that something was bothering her. He quickly figured out that she was upset because she had not been chosen to join the trip to Japan. Thinking back to their previous visit to Gunhwai, Dong-ho remembered that she had actually been the one who felt the most uncomfortable during that trip. Dong-ho thought that this would be Park Min-suk's first business trip with him, so it would also be a good opportunity to learn more about Min-suk's personality and abilities. Just then, Park Min-suk happily rushed into the room and excitedly called out to Dong-ho. He thanked him over and over, saying that because of Dong-ho, he was finally getting the chance to travel overseas. Min-suk cheerfully declared that ever since meeting Dong-ho, his entire life had changed. Meanwhile, Miss Choi sat quietly at her desk, tapping on her tablet with an unhappy expression. Seeing her reaction, Min-suk laughed awkwardly and thanked Dong-ho once again before lowering his voice. He then asked if Miss Choi was in a bad mood. Dong-ho smiled and changed the subject. Instead of answering, he asked Min-suk whether the acquisition of the oil company had gone smoothly. Min-suk immediately nodded and reported that everything had gone well. He explained that they had successfully acquired an oil company located in Yeongdong-po. Park Min-suk curiously asked Dong-ho why they had bought an oil company. He pointed out that their current business was focused on rice, and developing a new rice variety would take a long time. He wondered what an oil company had to do with their plans. Dong-ho explained that they needed another business to support them while they worked on developing the new rice variety. Hearing that, Min-suk excitedly guessed that they were planning to produce cooking oil. Dong-ho smiled and shook his head. He explained that it was not cooking oil. He revealed that there were two things he planned to bring back from Japan. One was the Japonica rice variety called Yukara, while the other would remain a secret for now. He promised to explain everything after they returned from Japan because he was not yet certain it would work. Sometime later, Dong-ho told his parents about his trip. When Kyung-suk heard this, he started crying, saying that his big brother was about to leave him behind again. Dong-ho quickly went over and comforted him, gently explaining that he was only going to Japan for a short business trip and would return soon. However, Kyung-suk continued crying. He reminded Dong-ho that he had said the same thing before, but back then it had taken him a very long time to come home. Dong-ho gently patted his little sister's head, trying to reassure him that this time would be different. However, Kyung-suk did not believe him and reminded Dong-ho that he had once promised to help him achieve everything he wanted. He asked if he had ever broken that promise or changed his mind. Dong-ho admitted that it was not because he doubted him, it was that Japan simply felt like a frightening place to him. Although he had never experienced the Japanese occupation himself, he had grown up hearing many stories about the terrible things that had happened during that time. Dong-ho smiled gently and held Kyung-suk by the cheeks. He told him that he had already made an important decision. No matter what happened, he would always put their mother first. Then Dong-ho asked Kyung-suk if he wanted to come with him to Japan. Hearing those words, Kyung-suk was immediately surprised, while their parents quietly watched the scene with gentle smiles. After hearing Kyung-suk's fears, Dong-ho asked him if he was really willing to go to Japan with him. Without hesitation, Kyung-suk declared that he would never let his big brother go there alone because he wanted to protect him. Hearing those words, Dong-ho could only smile in surprise. Dong-ho told Kyung-suk to pack his things because he would be traveling with him. Excited, Kyung-suk gathered several farming tools, including a flail, a sickle, a hoe, and a shovel. He proudly explained what each tool was, and then admitted that he had wanted to bring a gun as well but could not get one. His parents were left speechless by his strange preparations. Later, the brothers boarded a train to begin their journey. Kyung-suk innocently asked if they were going to conquer Japan, making everyone around him laugh. Dong-ho quickly reassured him that they were only taking a train and then a ship, so there was no need to think about such things. During the trip, Kyung-suk happily ate the food their mother had packed for him. Dong-ho told him that their mother had prepared it so he would not go hungry. He then handed Kyung-suk a bottle of soda and told him to drink it so the food would not get stuck in his throat. Kyung-suk eagerly drank the soda Dong-ho had given him, but the moment the fizzy drink touched his throat, he panicked. He screamed that his throat was burning and accidentally sprayed the soda everywhere. Shocked, he shouted for Mr. Min-suk and complained that Dong-ho had made him drink something strange. He even wondered if it was some kind of pesticide, making everyone around him laugh. Watching Kyung-suk's reaction, Dong-ho smiled awkwardly. As he looked at his mother, he realized how different she was from the person he remembered. Every time he saw her now, she seemed happier and more cheerful, and that filled him with joy. Mr. Min-suk patiently explained that the drink was simply soda. He told Kyung-suk that it was fizzy, which was why it made his throat feel strange, and that people drank it because it tasted good. Kyung-suk finally calmed down and declared that he would be relying on Mr. Min-suk from now on. After enjoying the train ride, the group transferred to a ship at Busan port. Before long, they arrived in Osaka, Japan. Looking around the city for the first time, Kyung-suk quietly realized that this was the real Japan. Even so, Mr. Min-suk nervously asked Dong-ho if it was really alright for him to be there. Min-suk looked around the city in silence. As his eyes landed on the familiar streets, the anger he had buried for so many years slowly returned. He admitted that it had been a long time since he had felt this angry. Min-suk looked around the city and quietly admitted that, for a country that had supposedly lost the war, Japan looked far more modern and impressive than he had expected. Seeing this, he felt angry for no real reason. He asked if it was wrong to feel that way. Lee Dong-ho replied that Min-suk was not wrong because he did not feel good about it either. Although Seo Min-wook, the body he now occupied, had never experienced the Japanese occupation, Lee Dong-ho had lived through its final years. Because of those memories, he could speak Japanese. The painful memories of the occupation still remained in his mind, making it impossible for him to look at the situation in a positive way. He reflected that Japan was a country that had lost World War II. It had been a war criminal nation that suffered devastating destruction from nuclear bombs. Its economy should have been pushed back by decades because of the massive war reparations it was expected to pay, but Japan had recovered so quickly because of the Korean War. When the war broke out, Japan became a major supplier of weapons, equipment, and other military goods. That opportunity helped the country's economy recover at an incredible speed, allowing it to grow into the prosperous nation it was in 1962. Min-suk looked around in amazement and admitted that everything was honestly shocking. He said it felt like they had entered a completely different world. Lee Dong-ho told him that they still had a long journey ahead and that for now they should focus on what they had come to Japan to obtain. As they continued walking, Kyung-suk suddenly looked around at the people on the street with a confused expression. She asked Lee Dong-ho if the people around them were really Japanese. He smiled and confirmed that they were. Kyung-suk then innocently asked why none of them had horns on their heads. Lee Dong-ho was briefly speechless before gently explaining that people did not have horns. He then told Kyung-suk that Japanese people were still ordinary people, just like Koreans. Although Japan had committed many terrible acts in the past, that did not mean they should fill their hearts with prejudice against every Japanese person. Lee Dong-ho smiled at Kyung-suk and gently called her name. He told her that instead of focusing on Japanese people, she should remember Japan as a country. He explained that even after losing a war, Japan had managed to rebuild itself and become a prosperous nation. He then promised Kyung-suk that he would make their own country, the country she lived in, even better than Japan one day. Hearing those words, Kyung-suk smiled brightly. She happily agreed and declared that she would always believe in her big brother. Just then, Lee Dong-ho noticed that Kyung-suk was still carrying a wooden laundry paddle. Smiling awkwardly, he told her to put it away somewhere. Min-suk looked at the paddle in surprise and asked how she had even managed to bring it all the way there. Min-suk quietly asked Kyung-suk if she really thought they could pull this off. Kyung-suk confidently whispered that they had no other choice because they were the only ones who could do it. Min-suk nodded. He recalled how difficult their journey had been. It had taken them 7 full days to travel from Osaka to Hokkaido. The trip had been so exhausting that even Lee Dong-ho had collapsed from fatigue along the way. Kyung-suk agreed, saying she had never expected her big brother to end up in such a state. As they hid in a rice field, they spotted an old farmer harvesting rice with a sickle. Min-suk quietly asked Kyung-suk if she trusted him. He then asked if she also trusted the uncle beside her. Before he could continue, Kyung-suk interrupted him and asked if he trusted her instead. Min-suk smiled and firmly replied that he did. He declared that they absolutely had to bring back the yukara rice seeds. Just then, the farmer suddenly noticed them. The old man turned around in surprise, making both Min-suk and Kyung-suk freeze in shock as they let out startled cries. Lee Dong-ho suddenly appeared behind Min-suk and Kyung-suk with a cheerful smile, startling them. Teasingly, he asked if they had really been planning to steal the rice seeds. Embarrassed, Min-suk quickly laughed and explained that it was all a misunderstanding. He admitted that he and Kyung-suk had simply gotten too carried away while pretending to carry out a secret mission. Smiling, Lee Dong-ho pointed toward the fields and explained that yukara rice was growing everywhere in the area. Realizing their dramatic plan had been completely unnecessary, Kyung-suk loudly declared that even though their grand plan had been exposed, they still could not give up. Lee Dong-ho watched the two with a smile. He already knew that Min-suk was unusually good at getting along with people, but he had not expected him to become so close to his little sister in such a short time. He felt grateful for that. Min-suk and Kyung-suk continued their playful act, promising each other that they would complete their mission safely. Kyung-suk saluted him and enthusiastically replied, "Yes, Captain." Lee Dong-ho then approached the owner of the rice field and asked if he could buy some yukara rice seeds. The farmer looked confused at first, but after Lee Dong-ho offered to pay extra, the old man happily agreed. Lee Dong-ho carefully looked at the yukara rice in the field and realized that these were the valuable seeds he had been searching for. As he held a handful of seeds in his palm, he thought that if he could bring them back to Korea, Director Hyo and the agricultural researchers would be able to develop a brand new rice variety. He believed that this new rice could one day help feed countless people. He carefully placed the precious seeds into a small glass bottle for safekeeping. He also thought that if they successfully developed an outstanding rice variety, it would benefit Japan as well because its people also ate Japanica rice. At the same time he smiled to himself, knowing that if Japan later imported the improved seeds, they would have to pay royalties. After safely storing the seeds, Lee Dong-ho smiled and announced that it was time to leave. However, Min-suk and Kyung-suk immediately protested. Kyung-suk jokingly asked if her big brother was sulking because they had enjoyed their little adventure without him. Min-suk joined in and teased him as well, saying that as the company president he should show a little more warmth. Pretending to be disappointed, he joked that he had expected better from him. Dong-ho smiled gently and told Min-suk and Kyung-suk that they had teased him enough. He then knelt in front of Kyung-suk and reassured her that everything was fine. He smiled warmly and pointed out that she was covered in dirt, even on her cute little face. As he gently wiped the dirt from her cheek, Kyung-suk giggled happily. A moment later, Kyung-suk excitedly ran toward Min-suk and asked him to give her backpack back. Watching her cheerful smile, Dong-ho realized that he had never imagined his mother could laugh, smile, and chat so happily. Seeing her enjoy herself filled him with happiness. As they prepared to leave, Dong-ho thought that obtaining the Yukara seeds had been much easier than he had expected. However, he knew that taking the seeds out of the country would be much more difficult because it would be considered smuggling. He decided to worry about that problem later. For now, he still had another important goal to complete, and he knew it would be even more difficult than the first. While they were walking, Min-suk curiously asked where Saitama was and why they were going there instead of returning home. Kyung-suk also looked at Dong-ho with curiosity and asked if they were not heading back to Korea yet. Dong-ho smiled and told the others that before returning home, there was one more place he wanted to visit. As they arrived at a small shop, Dong-ho thought to himself that the Yukara early maturing Japonica rice was the first cotton seed Mokwon had brought him. Now, he believed he had found the second cotton seed, another important item that could change the future. The three entered the shop, and Dong-ho politely greeted the owner. He asked if the shop had instant ramen. After the owner showed it to him, Dong-ho apologized for the unusual request and asked if they could cook and eat the ramen there. He assured the owner that they would pay generously. Soon the shop owner prepared 3 steaming bowls of ramen for them. As Min-suk and Kyung-suk looked at the unfamiliar food, they asked Dong-ho what it was. Kyung-suk curiously asked if it was noodles. Smiling confidently, Dong-ho told them not to worry and simply try it first. Kyung-suk looked at the bowl of noodles uncertainly and asked Dong-ho if it was really good. Dong-ho smiled confidently and assured her that it was. He told both Kyung-suk and Min-suk to stop worrying and simply taste it. Min-suk picked up the noodles but hesitated. He commented that the ramen smelled a little fishy. Even so, he and Kyung-suk finally took a bite. Meanwhile, Dong-ho thought that the moment Min-suk and Kyung-suk tasted it, both of them would be stunned. Their eyes would widen in surprise at how delicious it was. He expected them to ask what kind of food it was because they had never tasted anything like it before. He also expected Min-suk to ask if this was what they had come to Saitama to find. He believed Min-suk would think that this incredible food was the reason for their trip. Dong-ho smiled with satisfaction just thinking about it. However, he suddenly noticed Min-suk. After taking a bite, Min-suk's expression suddenly changed. Looking at him, Dong-ho frowned and asked if it was too salty. Confused, Min-suk looked at Dong-ho and asked if this was really supposed to be considered delicious. Kyung-suk frowned after another bite and complained that the noodles felt incomplete without kimchi. She wondered why the restaurant did not serve kimchi with them. Dong-ho quietly watched their reactions and wondered why they were acting that way. He assumed it was probably because it was their first time eating ramen. As he prepared to take a bite himself, something suddenly caught his attention. His expression changed, and after tasting the broth again, he immediately spat it out in disgust. Covering his mouth, Dong-ho finally realized what was wrong. He thought to himself that this was what Japanese ramen had tasted like during that time period. It was very different from the ramen he knew in the future, which explained why the flavor was so strange.